Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They possessed knowledge that took 20 years to master. They could read the stars, predict eclipses, and judge between kings. They were poets, philosophers, healers, and priests, wielding power that made Roman emperors nervous. And yet, they left us almost nothing. No temples of stone, no written texts, no inscribed monuments declaring their wisdom. They chose to vanish like smoke, leaving only whispers in oak groves and fragments filtered through the eyes of their enemies. The Druids commanded respect across the entire Celtic world, from the shores of Galatia to the mist-shrouded islands of Britain. Then they were gone, and we are left to wonder, what did they know that was worth guarding so carefully? What made them so dangerous that Rome sought to destroy every trace? Tonight, we will journey into the deep forests of Iron Age Europe to find what remains of these mysterious figures. We will walk through sacred groves where no stone marked the holy ground. We will sit with initiates, memorizing thousands of verses in the darkness. We will stand on Anglesea's shore as Roman soldiers set fire to ancient wisdom, and we will follow the thread of their influence as it winds through Irish monasteries, medieval manuscripts, and into the modern world, where the mystery of the Druids still captures our imagination. We cannot know them as they knew themselves. That gift died with the last of the old practitioners. But we can trace their shadows, and in those shadows, discover something profound about memory, power, and the price of keeping secrets. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel the veil between past and present, growing thin as we cross into the tangled forests of ancient Gaul and Britain, where oak trees older than memory spread their branches over clearings known only to the initiated, where smoke from sacred fires drifts through leaves, and where men in white robes move with quiet authority between the worlds of gods and mortals. The Celtic tapestry. To understand the Druids, we must first understand the vast and varied world of the Celts. Picture Europe in the final centuries before Christ's birth. From the Black Sea to the Atlantic, from the Alps to the Scottish Highlands, Celtic peoples dominated the landscape. They were not an empire. They had no single king, no unified government, no common capital. Instead, they existed as a constellation of tribes, each with its own territory, its own rulers, its own fierce identity. The Helvetii in what we now call Switzerland, the Arverni in central Gaul, the Iceni in eastern Britain, the Galatians, who migrated all the way to Asia Minor, hundreds of tribes, speaking related but distinct languages, sharing cultural threads while maintaining proud differences. What united them? Language formed part of the bond. The Celtic tongues, though varied, shared common roots, common structures, a family resemblance that allowed distant cousins to understand one another with effort. Art created another connection. The distinctive Celtic style, with its swirling curves and intricate knotwork, its love of spirals and its avoidance of straight lines, appeared on metalwork from Ireland to Romania. You could recognize a Celtic shield or brooch by sight, even if you could not place its specific tribal origin. Trade linked them: amber from the Baltic, tin from Cornwall, wine from the Mediterranean. All moved along trade routes that connected Celtic communities across vast distances. But perhaps most importantly, they shared a religion. The gods had different names in different regions, different stories, different sacred sites. Yet the structure of belief remained remarkably consistent. A pantheon of deities associated with natural forces, with crafts, with warfare, with the cycle of seasons. Sacred groves where worship occurred under open sky, animal sacrifice and ritual feasting, divination and prophecy. The belief in another world, close to our own, separated by the thinnest of veils. And everywhere, in every Celtic land, a special class of priests, judges, and learned men who served as the keepers of this sacred knowledge. These were the Druids. They were the thread that bound the tapestry together. A tribal chief in Gaul and a warrior queen in Britain might never meet, might know nothing of each other's politics or lineage, but they would both defer to the wisdom of their local Druids. They would both recognize the authority of these figures who stood apart from tribal feuds, who could travel freely between hostile territories, who answered to a power greater than any earthly king. The Druids were not rulers, exactly. They wielded no armies, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable in that fractious, warlike world. They possessed legitimacy, the right to judge, the authority to speak for the gods, the knowledge that took decades to acquire and could not be stolen by conquest. The problem of knowing. Before we venture further into the forest, we need to acknowledge a difficult truth. Almost everything we know about the Druids comes from people who were not Druids. Specifically, it comes from the Romans, who conquered the Celtic lands and brought their own perspectives, their own biases, their own agendas to the task of describing what they found. Julius Caesar wrote about Druids in his account of the Gallic Wars. He was a military commander, justifying his campaigns to the Roman Senate. He needed to make his enemies seem both dangerous and worthy of conquest. The historian Tacitus described the destruction of the Druidic stronghold on Anglesey. He was writing decades after the event, relying on second-hand accounts, shaping the narrative to reflect Roman values and Roman triumph. Pliny the Elder recorded the famous mistletoe ritual. He was a natural historian, fascinated by strange customs, but viewing them through the lens of Roman rationality, often emphasizing the exotic and the bizarre. These sources are invaluable. Without them, we would know almost nothing, but we must read them carefully. Always aware that we are seeing the Druids through a filter, the Romans were impressed by Druidic learning, but they also viewed Celtic religion as barbaric. They recognized Druidic authority, but they also feared it as a potential source of resistance. They preserved details, but they also made mistakes, misunderstood practices, and sometimes simply repeated rumors without verification. The Druids themselves wrote nothing down. This was not because they lacked writing. The Celts used Greek and Latin scripts for practical purposes, for trade and record keeping, but the sacred knowledge, the heart of Druidic teaching, was transmitted orally, deliberately, religiously. The reasons for this prohibition we can only guess at. Perhaps they believed that writing would profane the sacred. Perhaps they sought to protect their knowledge from outsiders. Perhaps the oral tradition itself was part of the teaching, the memorization process essential to understanding. Whatever the reason, the result is that we have no Druidic texts from the time when Druids still practiced openly. We do have Irish and Welsh manuscripts from the Middle Ages, written by Christian monks centuries after the Druids had disappeared as a formal institution. These preserve myths, stories, and customs that contain echoes of earlier beliefs. But they too must be approached cautiously. How much did Christianity reshape these tales? How much was lost in the centuries of oral transmission? How much was invented or embellished? These questions hover over every claim we make. So we proceed with humility, piecing together fragments, acknowledging gaps, accepting that some questions will never have certain answers. The mystery is part of the story. Perhaps it is even fitting. The Druids valued secrets. They kept their knowledge close. In some sense, they still do. Through Roman eyes. Let us meet our sources, these Roman observers, who became our reluctant guides to a world they helped destroy. Gaius Julius Caesar stands first among them. In the 50s BC, he led Roman legions into Gaul, conquering the Celtic tribes in a series of brutal campaigns that killed millions. His commentaries on the Gallic War served partly as military report and partly as political propaganda, but embedded in the warfare and the justifications, he included ethnographic observations about the peoples he was conquering. He wrote about the Druids with a mixture of respect and strategic assessment. He noted their power over the population, their role in education, their authority in religious matters. He described their exemption from military service and taxation, their annual gatherings at sacred sites, their judgments in disputes. He even suggested that the Druidic institution itself had originated in Britain, and that Gauls who wished to study the tradition in depth would travel across the Channel for training. Caesar had reasons to emphasize Druidic influence. If he could portray the Druids as a unifying force among the Gauls, then suppressing them became part of suppressing resistance. If he could suggest they encouraged human sacrifice, then Roman conquest became a civilizing mission. We must read him with these motivations in mind. And yet, his details often ring true, matching what we know from other sources, from archaeology, from the later Irish materials. He was there. He spoke with Gauls who knew the Druids personally. His account, for all its limitations, gives us a window into the 1st century BC that we cannot afford to dismiss. Publius Cornelius Tacitus wrote 2 generations later, in the early 2nd century AD. By his time, the Druids had been officially suppressed in Roman territories, driven to the edges of the empire, or forced into hiding. Tacitus was not a witness to living Druidic practice, but he recorded the stories of the conquest, including the dramatic assault on Anglesey in 61 AD, which we will explore in detail later. His prose is vivid, theatrical, designed to move Roman readers. He describes wild-haired women in black robes, calling down curses, druids with hands raised to heaven, groves dripping with human blood. How much of this was reality? How much was embellishment? We cannot be certain, but his account captures something true regardless. The Roman perception of the Druids as dangerous, alien, tied to a form of power that Rome could not tolerate. Strabo, a Greek geographer writing around the time of Christ's birth, provided details about Druidic practices based on earlier sources. Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic Natural History, recorded the mistletoe ritual and various bits of Druidic plant lore. Filtered through his interest in natural science, other writers, Diodorus Siculus, Lucan, Pomponius Mela, each added fragments, small details, passing references that help fill out the picture. None of these men were sympathetic observers. None were interested in preserving Celtic culture for its own sake. They wrote as conquerors, as civilizers, as men convinced of Roman superiority. And yet, through their words, carefully read, we can begin to see the shapes of figures moving through those ancient groves. We can begin to hear, however faintly, the voices they tried to silence. The 3 orders. Celtic society made room for those who worked with their minds rather than their hands, who served the gods rather than the chiefs, who preserved knowledge rather than wealth. The Romans called them all Druids sometimes, but the Celts themselves recognized important distinctions. 3 orders of learned men occupied the space between the warriors and the farmers, each with their own role, their own training, their own particular form of power. The bards held the lowest rank, but perhaps the widest influence. They were poets, musicians, the keepers of genealogies and tribal histories. Every important household wanted a bard. Kings employed them to compose praise poems, celebrating victories, to memorize the names of ancestors stretching back generations, to sing at feasts and ceremonies. A good bard could make your reputation. His verses, repeated and passed down, could ensure your name lived after your death. But a bard could also destroy you. Satirical poems had real power in Celtic society. A well-crafted satire could ruin a reputation, drive someone from their community, even, according to some accounts, cause physical harm. The Irish tales speak of satires that raised blisters on the face of the victim. Exaggeration, perhaps, but the underlying truth remains clear. Words had power, poets wielded it. The vates, sometimes called ovates, occupied the middle position. They were diviners, interpreters of omens, readers of signs in nature. When important decisions needed making, when the favour of the gods needed determining, when the outcome of a battle hung uncertain, the Vates would be consulted. They watched the flight of birds, studied the entrails of sacrificed animals, read meaning in thunder and lightning, in the way smoke rose from fires, in dreams and visions. Some sources suggest they also participated in sacrifice itself, conducting the rituals that connected the human and divine realms. They moved between the practical and the spiritual, translating the will of the gods into advice for mortal kings. And then, above both, stood the Druids proper. They were judges, philosophers, teachers, priests. Caesar tells us they settled all disputes, public and private. If a man was murdered, the Druids determined the blood price. If neighbouring tribes clashed over boundaries or grazing rights, the Druids arbitrated. If someone challenged a legal decision, the Druids rendered final judgment. Their verdicts carried weight beyond mere law. To defy a Druidic judgment risked religious sanction, exclusion from sacrifice, a separation from the community that amounted to social death. But the Druids were much more than judges. They preserved the calendar, determining the proper times for festivals, for planting and harvest, for war and peace. They educated the youth of noble families, teaching not just law and custom, but astronomy, natural philosophy, moral teaching, poetry. They conducted the most important religious ceremonies, speaking the words that connected worshippers to the divine. They memorized vast quantities of sacred verse, knowledge too holy or too powerful to be entrusted to writing. The three orders were not rigidly separated. A young man might begin as a bard, prove his abilities, and advance to study divination or law. The path to becoming a full druid required enormous dedication, but it was not closed to those with talent and determination. And all three orders shared certain privileges. Exemption from warfare, exemption from tribute, the right to travel freely between tribes, even tribes at war with each other, the ability to stop battles by walking between the armies, and commanding peace. In a world defined by violence, by constant tribal warfare, by the raw power of warriors and the ambitions of chiefs, these learned men represented something different. Not physical strength but knowledge, not conquest but continuity, not change but preservation. They were the memory of the people, the voice of the gods, the guarantee that some things remained constant even as kingdoms rose and fell. The 20-year path. You are 12 years old, and everything is about to change. You are standing in your father's hall. Outside, you can hear the sounds of the settlement, cattle lowing, dogs barking, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's workshop. Your father is a man of importance, not quite a chief, but wealthy enough, respected enough, that his opinions carry weight in tribal councils. You have brothers who will inherit his lands, his herds, his position, but you are different. Since childhood, the druid who visits your father's hall has watched you. He noticed how you remembered stories after hearing them once, how you could recite genealogies without stumbling, how you asked questions about the stars, about the festivals, about why things are done the way they are done. Now he is speaking to your father, and they are speaking about you. The words wash over you, formal phrases about honour and service, about the sacred calling, about the years of training ahead. You understand what is being decided. You will leave this place. You will leave your family, your friends, everything familiar. You will follow this man in his white robes to a place of learning, and you will not return until you are a different person entirely. The journey takes several days. You travel through forests you have never seen, past settlements where the people speak your language, but with unfamiliar accents. Finally, you arrive. It is not what you expected. There are no great buildings, no temples of stone. Just a clearing in an oak forest, a few wooden structures for sleeping and shelter, and scattered throughout the area, small groups of students sitting with teachers. Their voices a low murmur of memorization and recitation. An older student is assigned to you. He is perhaps 10 years your senior, kind but distant, already transformed by this place into something that is no longer quite a boy but not yet a man. He explains the routine. You will rise before dawn. You will memorize. All day, every day, you will memorize. Poetry first, thousands of lines. The creation stories, the deeds of heroes, the genealogies of tribes, the laws, civil and religious, the calendar and its meanings, the properties of plants, the movements of stars, the sacred formulas that cannot be spoken except at the proper times, in the proper places, with the proper intonations. You will memorize until your mind feels like it will crack. You will recite until your throat is raw. You will be corrected when you err, praised when you succeed, pushed always to remember more, to understand more deeply, to hold within yourself the accumulated wisdom of your people. Years pass. The child you were fades like morning mist. You grow taller, your voice deepens, but these physical changes are nothing compared to the transformation happening inside your skull. Your memory becomes something astonishing. You can hold entire genealogies spanning 20 generations. You can recite the laws covering every possible dispute, from cattle theft to murder. You can describe the rising and setting of stars through the year, predict eclipses, calculate the calendar's festivals without counting on your fingers. But it is not just memory. The knowledge is interconnected, each piece illuminating the others. The myths teach you about the gods and their natures. The laws reflect the divine order. The astronomy reveals the pattern of time itself. The plant lore connects you to the healing powers of the earth. Everything fits together, a vast web of understanding that takes decades to master. You are in your early 30s now. The training is almost complete. You have studied with multiple teachers, learned different traditions, different interpretations. You have traveled to other centers of learning, compared knowledge with druids from distant tribes. You have sat in judgment on practice cases, assisted at ceremonies, begun to teach younger students yourself. The man who began this journey is gone. In his place stands someone who carries the weight of tradition, who speaks with the authority of the ancients, who can guide the living and honor the dead. Soon, you will return to the world beyond these groves. You will take your place among the judges and teachers. You will speak, and warriors will listen. Chiefs will seek your counsel. The gods themselves will hear your prayers with special attention. 20 years to become this. 20 years to transform a boy into a vessel of sacred knowledge. It seems like forever. It passes like a moment. And now, you are ready. Masters of memory. The prohibition on writing sacred knowledge was absolute. Not because the Druids could not write. The Celts used Greek letters for trade, for contracts, for messages. Some used Latin script. Writing was a tool, understood and utilized when needed. But for the sacred tradition, for the heart of Druidic teaching, writing was forbidden. The knowledge must pass from mind to mind, voice to voice, generation to generation, held in human memory and nowhere else. Why? The sources do not tell us directly, but we can reconstruct possible reasons. Writing makes knowledge portable. Once words are fixed on parchment or carved in stone, they can be stolen, copied, distributed to those who have no right to them. The sacred teachings were precious, dangerous even, in the wrong hands. Keeping them oral kept them controlled. Only those who had earned the right through years of training, who had proven their worthiness, who had been judged fit by existing druids, could access the deepest mysteries. Writing also changes the nature of learning. When you can refer back to a text, memory becomes less important. The knowledge sits outside yourself, in an external object. But when everything must be memorized, when you carry the tradition inside your own mind, the act of learning becomes transformative. You do not simply know the verses, you become them. They shape your thinking, your understanding, your very consciousness. The method of transmission, was inseparable from the content itself. There was probably a religious dimension as well. The sacred could not be profaned by reduction to mere marks on a surface. The words of power, the names of gods, the formulas of ritual, these had to be spoken, had to be alive, in the breath and voice of the one who knew them. Writing might kill them, might drain away their power, like blood from a wound. So the Druids developed extraordinary techniques of memorization. Poetry was the primary method. Information encoded in verse is easier to remember than prose. The rhythm helps, the rhyme provides cues. The structured nature of poetry creates a framework on which facts can hang. The Druids composed in complex meters, using alliteration and repetition, creating verses designed specifically to be memorable. They also used what we might call mnemonic landscapes, associating information with physical places, creating mental journeys where each location triggers specific memories. A student might learn to walk through an imaginary grove, each tree representing a different body of lore, each clearing holding a different myth. The technique transforms abstract knowledge into something concrete, spatial, easier to navigate mentally. Repetition was constant. The same material would be reviewed daily, weekly, monthly, throughout the years of training. Not mindless repetition, but careful, thoughtful recitation, each time deepening understanding, catching nuances previously missed, connecting the material to other parts of the tradition. The students were not merely memorizing, they were internalizing, weaving the knowledge into the fabric of their being. And there was competition, encouragement from peers and teachers, public recitation where errors would be caught and corrected. The best students would be praised, their memories held up as examples. The social element reinforced the individual effort. You learned not just for yourself, but for the community of learners, for the chain of transmission, stretching back to the first Druids and forward to students not yet born. The result was a living library, a human encyclopedia distributed across hundreds of trained minds throughout the Celtic world. If a question arose about an obscure point of law, a Druid could be consulted and he would recite the relevant verses from memory. If a festival date needed confirmation, a Druid could calculate it using memorized astronomical tables. If a tribe's ancestry needed verification, a Druid could recite the genealogy, stretching back through the generations. This was power, real, practical power. In a world without written records, easily accessible to all, the one who remembered was the one who knew, and knowledge was authority. The Druids' memories made them indispensable. Warriors might be stronger, chiefs might be wealthier, but only the Druids carried the tradition entire within themselves. Only they could say with certainty what the ancestors had taught, what the gods required, what the law demanded. Their minds were temples, and the sacred knowledge lived there, preserved not in stone or parchment, but in the most fragile and most miraculous of vessels, human memory itself, the grove and the nemeton, no temples. This is what strikes the Roman observers again and again, what marks the Druids as different, as strange. Where are the great stone structures? Where are the roofed buildings with altars and statues? The Greeks had the Parthenon. The Romans had temples throughout their territories, massive constructions declaring the presence and power of the gods. But the Celts worshipped in groves. The sacred grove, the nemeton in the Celtic languages, was the heart of religious practice. Not all groves were sacred. The forests of Europe were vast, ancient, covering most of the landscape. But certain groves had been marked out as holy through tradition, through some event or vision that had revealed them as places where the veil between worlds grew thin. These were the nemetons, and they required no human construction because they were already perfect as the gods had made them. Picture an oak grove, far from any settlement, reached by paths known only to the initiated. The trees are old, older than any person living, older perhaps than the tribes themselves. Their trunks are massive, their bark rough and deeply furrowed, their branches spread overhead, creating a canopy that filters sunlight into soft green dimness. The ground is carpeted with fallen leaves, generations of them, composting down into rich earth. The air smells of growing things, of moisture and moss, of the slow decay that feeds new life. There is no roof but the sky visible through leaves. No walls but the trees themselves, standing like natural pillars. No floor but the earth, holy and uncut. No altar beyond a stone, or a section of cleared ground where offerings can be placed. Everything here has grown, not been built. The divine presence does not need human architecture. It is already here, in the oak's strength, in the earth's fertility, in the way sunlight and shadow play across the grove floor. The oak was especially sacred, though scholars debate whether all nematons were oak groves specifically, or whether other trees served as well. The oak was associated with thunder, with the sky, with the chief of the gods in various Celtic regions. It grew slowly, lived for centuries, endured storms and seasons. It was strength, endurance, wisdom. Its wood was prized. Its acorns fed pigs. Mistletoe, that strange parasite, grew on its branches, and we will speak of that mystery soon. But the nematon was more than just trees. It was a threshold place. The Celts believed in an otherworld, close to ours, separated by boundaries that could sometimes be crossed. Caves were such places. Springs and wells, the shores of lakes, the banks of rivers, the spaces where water met land, where forest met field, where the familiar touched the unknown, and the nematon, the sacred grove, was the threshold place par excellence. Here, standing among the oaks, you were neither fully in the human world nor in the world of the gods, but in between, in a space where both realms touched and where communication became possible. This is where the great ceremonies happened. The seasonal festivals, marking the turning of the year, the sacrifices, animal, and possibly, in earlier times or in extreme circumstances, human, the judgments, when Druids pronounced verdicts with the gods as witnesses. The initiations, when young people became adults, when warriors took oaths, when Druids conferred authority on new members of their order. All the most important moments of Celtic religious life occurred not in buildings made by human hands, but in these sacred groves, where the divine had already established its presence long before any person arrived. The Romans were disturbed by this. They associated civilization with temples, with stone architecture, with the imposition of human order onto the landscape. The nematon represented something they found barbaric, a worship too close to nature, too wild, too uncontrolled. When they conquered Celtic lands, one of their first acts was often to cut down the sacred groves. This was practical, removing centres of druidic power and potential resistance. But it was also ideological, replacing Celtic worship with Roman religion, wild groves with ordered temples. Yet the power of the nematon was not easily erased. Even after the groves were cut, even after Christianity replaced the old religion, people remembered holy wells remained holy, now dedicated to Christian saints. Festival days were transformed, but not abandoned. The understanding that certain places held special power, that nature itself could be a kind of temple, this understanding persisted. It persists, even now. Walk into an old forest, stand among trees that have lived for centuries, and you might feel it still. That sense of presence, of something larger than yourself, of a boundary being crossed. The Druids understood this instinctively. They built no monuments that we can excavate and measure. They left no inscriptions declaring their theology in words we can read. But they knew where the sacred lived. They knew that worship did not require stone walls and golden statues. The temple was already there, growing, living, breathing. The temple was the earth itself, the oak and the ash, the well and the grove. All that was needed was to recognize it, to maintain it, to gather there with proper reverence, and let the boundaries between worlds grow thin. The Nemeton was not just a place, it was a statement, a declaration that the sacred was not something separate from nature, not something that needed to be built or created. It was already present, woven into the fabric of the world, waiting to be honoured. And in the darkness of the grove, under the ancient oaks, with the smell of earth and the sound of leaves whispering overhead, the Druids stood at that threshold, speaking to gods and listening for their answers, reading the sky. The night sky over Celtic Europe was not the dimmed, light-polluted veil we see today from our cities. It was a vast darkness scattered with thousands of points of light, a constantly shifting display that commanded attention and rewarded careful observation. And as Avasi, the Druids watched. They had been watching for generations, centuries perhaps, accumulating knowledge, recognizing patterns, understanding cycles that played out over years and decades. Caesar tells us the Druids engaged in lengthy discussions about the stars and their motions, about the size of the universe and the earth, about the nature of the divine and the physical world. This was not idle stargazing. The calendar depended on celestial observation. The festivals had to occur at precisely the right times, aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Getting the timing wrong meant dishonoring the gods, disrupting the agricultural cycle, creating chaos in the carefully ordered progression of the year. The Celts used a lunisolar calendar, one that had to reconcile the moon's phases with the sun's annual journey. This is mathematically complex. The lunar month is approximately 29.5 days. 12 lunar months give you 354 days, 11 days short of the solar year. Without adjustment, the calendar drifts, festivals occurring earlier and earlier each year, harvest celebrations arriving when grain is still green in the fields. The solution requires intercalation, adding extra months periodically to keep lunar and solar cycles aligned. We have physical evidence of Celtic astronomical sophistication in the Coligny calendar, discovered in fragments in eastern France in the 1800s. It dates to the 2nd century AD, already after Roman occupation, but it preserves older Celtic time reckoning methods. The calendar is bronze, inscribed with a 62-month cycle covering 5 years. It shows a complex system of months, designated as lucky or unlucky, of days counted in a peculiar way that begins at sunset rather than dawn, of intercalary months added to maintain alignment. The mathematics required to construct such a system, to test it over generations, to refine it into reliability, this implies dedicated observation and calculation over long periods. The Druids could predict eclipses. Pliny mentions this, though he provides few details. Eclipse prediction requires understanding the complex relationship between sun, moon, and earth, recognizing the cycles that bring them into alignment. The Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years, was known to Babylonian astronomers. Whether the Druids discovered it independently or learned it through trade contacts with Mediterranean cultures, we cannot say. But the ability itself is documented. Another piece of evidence for serious astronomical work. They used the stars for navigation, especially important for sea travel between Britain and the European mainland. Certain stars or star patterns served as guides. The position of constellations marked the seasons. When particular stars rose just before dawn, you knew it was time to plant, to harvest, to prepare for winter. The sky was a calendar you could read anywhere, a clock that never needed winding, a guide that never got lost. But Druidic astronomy was not purely practical. The movements of heavenly bodies held religious significance. The sun's annual death and rebirth at the winter solstice, the moon's phases reflecting the cycles of life, death, and renewal. The planets, wanderers against the fixed stars, each associated with particular deities or powers. To understand the sky was to understand divine patterns, to glimpse the order underlying apparent chaos. Some modern writers have claimed the Druids built Stonehenge and the other great stone circles. This is romantic speculation, not supported by evidence. Stonehenge was ancient long before the Druids, constructed thousands of years earlier by peoples whose culture had no connection to the Celts. But the Druids may well have used these sites. Ancient sacred places tend to remain sacred. It is entirely possible that Celtic peoples looked at these mysterious stone arrangements, recognized their astronomical alignments, and incorporated them into their own religious practice. They did not build them, but they may have understood them. The knowledge was power, practical, and spiritual both. A druid who could tell you when to plant, when the rains would come, when the festival should occur, when eclipses would darken the sun, such a person commanded respect, born of demonstrated competence. And in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural was thin, where divine will expressed itself through weather and seasons, understanding the patterns of heaven meant understanding, to some degree, the will of the gods themselves. The healing hand. The forests and fields of Celtic Europe were vast pharmacies for those who knew what to look for. Every plant had properties, uses, dangers. The Druids studied them systematically, accumulating botanical knowledge across generations, refining their understanding through careful observation and, undoubtedly, occasional tragic mistakes. Some of this knowledge we can reconstruct from later sources. The Irish medical manuscripts, written by hereditary physician families in medieval times, preserve plant lore that likely extends back to Druidic practice. Pliny, despite his Roman perspective, recorded Celtic beliefs about various herbs, providing glimpses into medical practice, and archaeology reveals the kinds of plants that were cultivated or gathered in Celtic settlements, offering clues about what they valued and used. Willow bark for pain and fever. We know the Celts used this because we find willow remains in significant quantities at various sites, and because the tradition of willow as a pain reliever persisted through medieval times and beyond. Willow contains salicylic acid, the compound that gives us modern aspirin. The Druids could not have known the chemistry, but they observed the effect. A tea made from willow bark reduced fever, eased headaches, soothed general aches, reliable enough that the knowledge spread and persisted. Meadowsweet, another plant containing salicylic compounds, served similar purposes. Its pleasant smell made it popular for strewing on floors, but it had medicinal applications as well. Yarrow stopped bleeding, aided in wound healing. Comfrey promoted bone knitting, useful in a society where injuries from warfare and labour were common. Valerian calmed anxiety, aided sleep. Street John's wort, though named for a Christian saint much later, was used in pre-Christian times for what we would now call mild depression. The Druids understood that dosage mattered, that plants could heal or harm depending on how they were prepared and administered. Foxglove, which contains compounds that affect heart rhythm, was probably known to them. In tiny amounts, carefully measured, it could be therapeutic. In excess, it killed. The boundary between medicine and poison was a matter of knowledge and care. They practiced surgery. We have evidence of trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull, from Celtic sites. Some of these show healing, meaning the person survived the procedure. The reasons for trepanation are debated. It might have been medical, an attempt to relieve pressure from head injuries. It might have been ritual, creating an opening for spirits to enter or leave. Possibly both at once. No clear line existing between medical and magical treatment, but the practice required considerable skill. Cutting into a living skull without causing fatal bleeding or infection is not a simple matter. The Druids, or those they trained, had developed techniques that sometimes worked. Broken bones were set, splints and bandages applied, the use of herbal poultices to prevent infection, amputation when necessary, a terrible but sometimes life-saving operation. The survival rates were probably low compared to modern medicine, but not zero. People lived through injuries that should have killed them, suggesting competent care But Celtic medicine was not purely empirical. It existed within a worldview where physical and spiritual health were inseparable. Illness might result from offending the gods, from curse or hex, from spiritual imbalance, as much as from physical causes. A druid treating a patient might prescribe both herbal remedies and religious rituals, offerings to healing deities, charms and amulets for protection, prayers and incantations spoken over the sick. The goddess Sirona was associated with healing springs. Archaeological evidence shows shrines at thermal waters throughout Celtic regions, places where people came seeking cures. The Druids, as priests, would have presided over these shrines, interpreting the divine healing power of the waters, perhaps combining the beneficial minerals in the water with herbal treatments and spiritual counsel. Medicine, religion, and nature interwoven so tightly that separating them would have seemed strange, even meaningless. Some plants were sacred beyond their practical uses. The oak, of course, but also the hazel, associated with wisdom. Rowan was protective. Elder had fairy associations and required careful, respectful harvesting. These beliefs shaped how plants were gathered, at what times, with what words spoken, what offerings made. Gathering medicine was itself a ritual act, requiring proper relationship with the plant and with the divine forces that gave it power. The boundary between healer and poisoner was permeable. The same knowledge that saved lives could end them. A druid who understood deadly nightshade's properties could use it to ease pain or to kill. This gave them power of a particularly intimate kind. They could harm you in ways that left no mark, that looked like natural death. Roman sources sometimes hint at this darker side of druidic knowledge, suggesting that poisoning was a known danger when dealing with these learned men who understood too much about what should and should not be consumed. The nature of all things. Beyond the practical knowledge of stars and plants, beyond lore and genealogy, the Druids possessed a philosophical system, a way of understanding existence itself. The sources give us only fragments, passing references, comments filtered through Greek and Roman philosophical frameworks. But from these fragments, we can begin to sketch the outlines of Druidic thought. Caesar tells us the Druids taught about the immortality of the soul, though not in the sense Christians would later understand it. The Druidic doctrine, as Caesar describes it, held that souls do not die but pass after death from one body to another. This is usually interpreted as a form of reincarnation or metempsychosis, similar to ideas found in Greek philosophy, in Hinduism, in various other traditions. Whether the Celts developed this independently or absorbed it through contact with Mediterranean culture, we cannot know with certainty, but Caesar suggests they believed it firmly, and that this belief made them fearless in battle. If death is not an ending but a transition, if the soul continues into another life, then the fear of dying loses some of its grip. The later Irish sources support this, though details are frustratingly vague. Stories speak of heroes reborn, of the Tuatha De Danann living in the seed, the fairy mounds after being displaced by mortal peoples. The line between life and death, between this world and the other world, is presented as permeable, crossable in both directions under certain circumstances. The dead are not gone, they are elsewhere, in another form, and they might return. But the Druidic understanding of the soul went deeper than simple reincarnation. There was a sense of unity, underlying apparent diversity, of connection between all living things. The same life force that animated humans moved through animals, through plants, through the earth itself. Everything was alive in some sense, everything connected, everything part of a vast web of being. This is why nature was sacred. Not because the gods lived apart from nature, looking down on it, but because the divine was in nature, was nature, expressed itself through every growing thing, every flowing stream, every gust of wind. The Druids thought in triads, a distinctive feature of Celtic intellectual culture that persisted long after the Druids themselves had vanished. The world was structured in three realms: earth, sea, and sky. Three classes of society: those who pray, those who fight, those who work. Three aspects to time: past, present, and future, all somehow existing simultaneously for those with eyes to see. This triadic thinking created a framework for organizing knowledge, for understanding relationships, for grasping patterns. They understood that the universe operated according to order, that patterns repeated, that effects followed causes. This was not materialist science as we understand it. The causes might be divine will, the patterns might be sacred, but there was order nonetheless. The seasons returned reliably. The moon waxed and waned on schedule. Children resembled their parents. Seeds produced plants of the same type. Understanding these patterns, these regularities, was essential to functioning in the world, to making predictions, to exercising control over your circumstances. Justice and truth held central importance in Druidic philosophy. The Irish had a concept called fear flathamon, the truth of the ruler, the idea that a just king brought prosperity, while an unjust one brought blight, famine, disaster. The universe responded to moral behavior, a society that upheld truth, that honored its obligations, that treated people fairly, would thrive. One that embraced lies and injustice would suffer. This was not merely a moral teaching. It was seen as a fundamental law of existence, as real and reliable as the changing seasons. The other world, that realm adjacent to our own, was not heaven or hell in the Christian sense. It was the land of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, divine or semi-divine beings who had once ruled Ireland before the coming of mortals. It was a place of eternal youth, of feasting and beauty, where time moved differently, where a day might be a year in the mortal world, or a year might pass as a day. It could be reached through certain doorways, cave mouths, ancient burial mounds, lakes and wells. On certain nights, especially Samhain, when the year died and was reborn, the barriers thinned, and beings from the other world might cross into ours, and mortals might venture, intentionally or accidentally, into theirs. The gods themselves were not creators standing outside creation. They were powers within it, aspects of nature personified, forces that governed specific domains. A thunder god, who was also a warrior god, associated with oak trees and high places. A goddess of the land itself, of sovereignty, who chose kings and gave or withheld fertility. A god of skill and craft, patron of metalworkers and poets, a goddess of healing waters. These are not the only gods. Celtic religion was not unified, and different tribes emphasized different deities. But certain patterns recur, suggesting shared understanding of how divine power manifested in the world. The Druids, as priests and philosophers, explored these ideas, debated them, refined them across generations. They created a worldview that was sophisticated, coherent, capable of explaining human experience and natural phenomena. It was not written down in systematic treatises. It lived in oral teaching, in myths and stories, in ritual practice, and when the Druids were suppressed, when the oral transmission was broken, most of it vanished. We are left guessing, reconstructing from fragments, knowing that we have lost something profound and irrecoverable. The bard's tongue, his name, let us say, was Caradoc, though any Celtic name would serve. He was a bard of considerable skill, his voice strong, his memory prodigious, his ability to compose verses on the spot renowned throughout the region. He served no single lord, but travelled between the halls of various chiefs. Always welcome because his presence elevated any feast, because his praise brought honour, and because everyone, privately, feared what he might say, if insulted or turned away. He arrived at the settlement of a minor chief named Cunabellin on an autumn evening. With darkness coming early and rain threatening from low clouds. He was offered a place by the fire, food and beer, and the chief steward provided him with a good cloak to replace his travel-stained one. This was proper hospitality, the kind that earned good reports. Caradoc would speak well of this place. The feast began. Roasted pork, still the pride of Celtic tables, bread and cheese, beer brewed from barley, strong and slightly sour. The hall filled with warriors, household members, guests from nearby settlements. Torches smoked in brackets on the walls. Dogs fought over scraps beneath the tables. Children ran wild until their mothers gathered them for bed. The noise rose in waves, laughter and arguments, and the clatter of wooden plates. Cunobelin called for silence. This was the moment for the bard to earn his supper. Caradoc stood, all eyes turned to him. He began with the expected things. Praise for Cunobelin's hospitality, for his fair judgment in disputes, for his success in last season's raiding against a neighbouring tribe. The verses were polished, traditional, but Caradoc delivered them well, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Cunobelin beamed. His warriors nodded approval, but then Caradoc shifted. He told an old story, one of the heroes from generations past. A warrior named Cadwallon, famous for his strength and his generosity. Cadwallon had given gifts freely, armed his followers well, never counted the cost. He had died young in battle, but his name lived on because bards sang of him. The implication hung in the smoky air. Generosity brings lasting fame. A chief who hoards his wealth, who is stingy with rewards, who counts every ring and talk too carefully, such a man will be forgotten. Cunobelin was not a fool. He understood. This was not praise. This was a suggestion that verged on criticism. Caradoc was implying, gently but clearly, that better hospitality was expected. A gift should be offered to a bard of his standing. Something generous enough to be worth singing about. The chief hesitated. He was not a wealthy man. His territory was small, his resources limited, but the pressure was real. The hall was watching. If he appeared cheap, if he offended this bard, the consequences could be severe. Caradoc might compose a satire, and satires spread. Other bards would pick them up, repeating them, embellishing them. Your reputation could be destroyed. No warrior would serve a chief famous for stinginess. No neighbouring chief would ally with someone who had been properly satirized. Cunobelin stood. He unclasped a bronze brooch from his own cloak, fine work with intricate designs, worth perhaps 3 cattle. He presented it to Caradoc, with formal words about honouring the keeper of memory, the voice of the ancestors, the preserver of truth. Caradoc accepted with grace. He then delivered verses praising Cunobelin's wisdom and generosity, comparing him favourably to the great chiefs of old. The hall relaxed, crisis averted, honour satisfied on both sides. But after Caradoc left, travelling on to the next settlement and the next feast, Cunobelin's steward did calculations, the cost of hospitality, the value of the brooch. It was steep, and yet, what choice had there been? To offend a bard was to invite disaster. Better to pay. Everyone paid. It was the price of having your name remembered, your deeds celebrated, your reputation maintained. In another settlement, the story went differently. A chief named Veric, proud and foolish, had refused a bard's subtle request for proper gift-giving. The bard left quietly enough, but within a month, a satire was circulating. Vicious verses about Veric's supposed cowardice, his weak arm in battle, his failure to protect his people. Untrue mostly, but truth mattered less than the power of repeated verse. Warriors began leaving Veric's service. His authority crumbled. Within a year, a cousin had challenged him and taken control of the territory. This was the power bards wielded. Not the power of the sword, not the power of wealth, but the power of words, of reputation, of memory itself. In a culture without writing, where history lived in oral tradition, The one who controlled the narrative controlled everything. Kings might rule through force, druids through religious authority, but bards ruled through the one thing that outlived both force and religion: story. And no one, not the mightiest chief, not the wisest druid, not the fiercest warrior, could afford to be on the wrong side of a bard's tongue. Judges of the people, the dispute came before the druids on a spring morning, cold but clear. Two men, neither of high rank but both freemen of good standing, each claiming ownership of a particular field. The field was good land, fertile, well-drained, worth fighting over. Both men had presented their cases privately to the local chief, but he, wisely, had refused to judge between them. The matter touched on old boundaries, on inheritances 2 generations past, on verbal agreements that might or might not have been made between fathers now dead. This was work for the druids. They gathered at the usual place, an oak grove, a short walk from the settlement. 3 druids sat in judgment, not just one. Important cases required multiple voices, multiple memories, insurance against error or corruption. The druids were old men, all 3, their beards grey, their faces lined, their eyes sharp, despite their years. They had spent decades memorizing law, hearing cases, building reputations as fair judges. To be summoned before them was both intimidating and, in its way, an honour. Your case mattered enough for their attention. The first man spoke. He told his story carefully, clearly, presenting his understanding of the boundaries, tracing his ownership back through his father and grandfather. He had witnesses, an old woman who remembered the grandfather working that field, a neighbour who could testify about where the boundary stones had been before someone had moved them. He spoke with confidence, believing his case strong. The second man then presented his version. Different boundaries, different understanding of what had been agreed. His own witnesses, equally certain, equally sincere. As he talked, contradictions emerged. Both could not be right. Either someone was lying, or memories had shifted over time, or old agreements had been imprecise, leaving room for honest disagreement. The druids listened without interruption. When both men had finished, when all witnesses had been heard, the druids conferred in low voices. Then the eldest spoke. He recited, from memory, the relevant sections of law. The verses were in an archaic dialect, formal language preserved from generations past. They covered inheritance, boundaries, witness testimony, the relative weight of different types of evidence. The recitation took several minutes. Everyone listened in silence. This was authority manifest, the accumulated wisdom of the ancestors, held intact in the druids' memory. Then came the judgment. The druids had decided in favour of the first man, but not simply. They ruled that the field should be divided, the first man taking the larger portion, but the second man receiving a smaller section and compensation in cattle for the rest. Both men had elements of truth in their claims. The solution should reflect that. Neither would get everything they wanted, but neither would lose everything either. Justice, as the druids understood it, meant balance, restoration of harmony, solutions that allowed both parties to maintain honour. The judgment was final. There was no appeal. To challenge a druidic verdict was to challenge the gods themselves. Both men accepted, however reluctantly. They swore oaths before the druids to abide by the decision. A new boundary was marked. Compensation was calculated. The matter was settled. But the druids' legal authority extended far beyond property disputes. They judged accusations of murder, setting the blood price that a killer's family owed to the victim's family. They mediated between tribes, preventing blood feuds from spiralling into wars. They oversaw contracts, witnessing oaths, ensuring agreements were honoured. They determined penalties for crimes, from cattle theft to violation of sacred sites. Their most powerful sanction was exclusion from sacrifice. If someone defied a druidic judgment, refused to pay a blood price, broke a sacred oath, the Druids could declare them outside the community's religious life. Such a person could not participate in festivals, could not make offerings to the gods, could not be buried in ancestral grounds. In a society where religion permeated every aspect of life, where communal ritual bound people together, this exclusion was devastating. You became a ghost, socially dead, even while physically living. Caesar describes annual gatherings of Druids at a specific location in Gaul, a sacred site where Druids from various tribes assembled to discuss matters of law, to share knowledge, to maintain consistency in their judgments. This suggests a level of organization beyond individual tribal boundaries, a recognition that law itself transcended local politics. A judgment in one territory should align with judgments elsewhere. The Druids were creating, through their memorized verses and shared training, something approaching a common legal culture across the Celtic world. They were not merely arbitrators, they were living law libraries, their memories containing precedents, principles, procedures. When they spoke with authority that combined religious sanction, social tradition, and demonstrated wisdom. Warriors might have more immediate power, chiefs might command more resources, but in matters of justice, in the resolution of conflicts that could tear communities apart, the Druids held authority that even the mightiest warrior respected. Or if he did not respect it, he learned to fear it, because a Druid's curse could destroy as surely as any sword. The turning wheel, the Celtic year turned like a great wheel, divided not by the Roman calendar's rigid structure, but by the rhythms of nature itself, by the agricultural cycle, by the visible changes in the world around them. 4 major festivals marked the wheel's turning, 4 moments when the veil between human and divine grew thin, when special observances were required, when the community gathered to honour the gods and ensure the year's continued prosperity. Samhain came at the end of October, by our reckoning, the beginning of November by theirs. This was the end of the pastoral year, when livestock were brought down from summer pastures, when animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered, when the bounty of autumn was tallied and stored. But it was more than a practical marker. Samhain was when the year died. The long darkness began. The earth turned cold and hard. Plants withdrew into themselves. The visible world diminished, and at this moment of death, the other world pressed close. The barriers weakened. The dead could return, walking among the living for one night. The seed mounds opened. Spirits emerged. Dangerous times, requiring propitiation. Bonfires were lit. Great communal fires that pushed back the darkness, that purified, that protected. Cattle were driven between the flames to cleanse them before winter housing. People gathered around the fires for safety, for warmth, for the comfort of community in the face of oncoming darkness. Divination was practiced at Samhain more than at any other time. The future could be glimpsed when boundaries weakened. Young people sought omens about marriage, about fortune, about the year ahead. The Druids performed more elaborate rituals, reading signs, consulting the gods about the tribe's fate. What would the winter bring? Would there be enough food? Would sickness strike? Would enemies attack when defenses were weakened by cold and snow? Feasting accompanied the sacred rites, as it did at all major festivals. The slaughtered animals provided fresh meat, a last abundance before winter's lean months. Mead and beer flowed. Stories were told, especially stories of the ancestors, of heroes now dwelling in the other world. At Samhain, when the dead were close, remembering them properly mattered more than ever. Imbolc arrived at the start of February, the earliest stirrings of spring. Ewes began lactating, the first milk of the year appearing, hence the festival's name, which relates to in the belly, or possibly ewe's milk. This was a turning point. The worst of winter had been survived. Days grew visibly longer. Hope returned. Imbolc was sacred to Brigid, a goddess associated with fire, poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Her festival marked transformation. The slow shift from death to life. The hearth fires in every home were ritually renewed. Old fires extinguished, new ones kindled from a sacred source, carrying blessing into every household. Brigid's crosses, made from rushes, were crafted and placed above doorways for protection. Wells dedicated to her were visited, offerings left. Water drawn from these wells in bulk held special power for healing, for blessing, for ensuring fertility in the coming season. Beltane came at the start of May, the beginning of summer proper. This was the festival of fire and fertility, when cattle were driven to summer pastures, when crops were growing strongly, when the earth's generosity became visible. Two great bonfires were lit, and livestock driven between them for blessing and protection. People leaped over the flames for luck. Young couples slipped away into the woods, and what happened there was between them and the gods of fertility. This was a joyful festival, celebrating life's victory over death, abundance after scarcity. Flowers were gathered and woven into garlands. The May tree, decorated, became a focus of celebration. Dancing, singing, games. The darkness of Samhain seemed impossibly distant. The world was green and growing, full of promise and possibility. And then Luna Sad, at the start of August, named for the god Lugh. This was harvest time, when the first grains ripened, when the earth's gifts could finally be gathered and consumed. Trial marriages were contracted at Lugnasad, year and a day unions that could be made permanent or dissolved after the trial period. Games and contests occurred, displaying skill in warfare, athletics, poetry. Tribute was paid to chiefs. Legal cases were heard. This was a time of gathering, in every sense. Gathering crops, gathering community, gathering the fruits of the year's labour. Each festival had its sacrifices, animals offered to the gods with prayers and formal words. The blood fed the divine powers that maintained the world's order. The meat fed the community. Nothing was wasted. The bones might be buried ritually or used for tools. The hides became leather. Even the entrails served purposes, examined by the Vates for signs, then cooked and eaten. Between these four great festivals, smaller observances mark the solstices and equinoxes. The winter solstice, the longest night, when the sun seemed to die, and then miraculously began its return. The summer solstice, the sun's triumph, the longest day, the equinoxes, balance points, moments of equilibrium between light and dark, all required acknowledgement, ritual recognition of the turning wheel, gratitude to the powers that kept it turning. The Druids maintained this calendar, calculated the correct dates, led the rituals, spoke the necessary words. Without them, the wheel might falter, the seasons might fail, chaos might return. Their knowledge was not merely academic, it was essential to the world's continued functioning, or so it was believed. And that belief gave them power that no chief could match, because a chief might rule a tribe, but the Druids maintained the very order of time itself. The mistletoe mystery. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, recorded one of the most famous Druidic rituals, though he writes as an outsider, fascinated, but also somewhat dismissive of what he considers Celtic superstition. Still, his account has shaped imagination for 2,000 years, becoming the iconic image of the Druid in popular thought. The ritual occurred on the 6th night of the moon, Pliny tells us, 6 days after the new moon, when the crescent had grown visible, but was still slender, still young. The Druids had been searching for mistletoe, that strange plant that grows parasitically on tree branches, especially, in their understanding, on oak trees. Finding mistletoe on an oak was rare, Pliny says, and such a discovery was treated as a gift from the gods themselves, a sign of divine favour requiring immediate and proper response. The Druids prepared white robes, which Pliny mentions as their characteristic dress. 2 white bulls led to the site, the gathered community, for this was not a secret rite but a public ceremony. and a druid who would perform the actual cutting, for not just anyone, could touch such a sacred substance. Picture the scene. The oak stands massive, ancient, its branches spreading wide. High up, visible against the sky, a clump of mistletoe grows, its leaves yellowish-green, its berries white and waxy. The Druids have marked this tree, noted the mistletoe's presence, and planned the ceremony for the appropriate lunar phase. The sixth night has arrived. Sunset fades. The moon rises, a slim arc of silver in the darkening sky. The crowd gathers quietly. This is holy work, requiring reverence. The white bulls stand patient, unaware of their fate. A druid approaches the oak. He carries a golden sickle, Pliny tells us. Though whether this was literal gold or bronze that appeared golden, we cannot know. Gold is soft, impractical for cutting, but it is sacred, associated with the sun, with the divine. Perhaps the sickle was gilded. Perhaps it was purely ceremonial, used only for this one purpose. The druid climbs. In some versions, he is lifted by others, or a ladder is used. The oak's lowest branches are high. Reaching the mistletoe requires effort, but eventually, he is positioned correctly. He speaks words, prayers, or incantations that Pliny did not record or did not understand. Then he cuts. The golden sickle severs the mistletoe from the branch. It falls, and critically, it must not touch the ground. Others wait below with a white cloth, catching the falling plant. Ground touching would profane it, render it useless. The power must be preserved intact. The mistletoe secured, the druid descends. Now comes the sacrifice. The two white bulls are killed, their blood offered to the gods who granted the mistletoe, their meat to be distributed among the people. The prayers continue. Requests for fertility, for healing, for blessing on the tribe. The mistletoe will be distributed in small portions, treasured, used for medicine, for protection, perhaps kept until the next such ceremony a year hence. Why mistletoe? Why this plant specifically? It grows without roots in earth, drawing nourishment from the tree itself. It stays green through winter when other plants die. It appears mysteriously, bird droppings, carrying the seeds high into branches, where they germinate in bark crevices. It seems to belong neither fully to earth nor to sky, but to exist in between, liminal, neither living nor dead in the normal sense. It embodied paradox, threshold existence, the kind of anomaly that marked sacred power. The Druids believed mistletoe to be a cure-all, Pliny says, an antidote to poisons, a fertility charm for livestock, a medicine against epilepsy. Modern botany knows mistletoe contains compounds that are indeed bioactive, though also toxic in sufficient quantities. The Druids were not entirely wrong to see medicinal properties, but they wrapped that practical knowledge in religious significance, understanding the plant as carrying divine power, not merely chemical compounds. The ritual also reinforced Druidic authority. Only they could perform it. Only they knew the correct words, the proper timing, the sacred procedures. A chief might be wealthy, a warrior might be strong, but neither could cut the sacred mistletoe. That required Druidic knowledge, Druidic authority, Druidic connection to the divine. The ceremony was a demonstration, a public display of unique power, a reminder that some things required the Druids, could not be done without them. Did they believe it literally, that the words spoken, the golden sickle, the white cloth, the sacrificed bulls, that all of this actually transferred divine power into the plant? Or was there a level of knowing performance, ritual done because tradition demanded it, because the community expected it, because the role of druid required playing the part? We cannot know. Perhaps the question itself is anachronistic, importing modern skepticism into a world where the boundary between symbolic and literal was less distinct, where ritual action and actual power were understood as inseparable. The mistletoe ritual gives us a glimpse, however filtered through Roman eyes, of Druidic ceremony. The attention to timing, to proper procedure. The use of colour, white robes and bulls and cloth, visually striking, symbolically significant. The combination of botanical knowledge and religious practice. The public nature of it, binding community together through shared witness of sacred action. And the sense of power, real power, being accessed and deployed, not merely imagined but present, effective, necessary. The question of sacrifice. This is the uncomfortable topic, the one that turns the romantic image of the nature-loving Druid into something darker. The Romans accuse the Celts, and the Druids specifically, of human sacrifice. Not occasionally, not in extreme circumstances, but regularly, systematically, as part of normal religious practice. Caesar writes about it. Tacitus mentions it. Strabo describes it in detail. Are they telling the truth? Are they exaggerating? Are they inventing atrocities to justify Roman conquest? Let us examine the evidence carefully, without either defending the indefensible or accepting Roman propaganda uncritically. The Roman sources describe various methods, burning people alive in great wicker figures, constructed in human or animal form, filled with victims, and set alight, drowning in sacred bogs, hanging from trees in sacred groves, stabbing and reading omens from the death throes. The accounts are consistent enough, across multiple writers, to suggest they are repeating a common tradition, though whether that tradition reflected reality or Roman myth-making about barbarian others is the question. Archaeology provides partial confirmation. Bog bodies, preserved in peat for 2,000 years, have been discovered across northern Europe, including Celtic territories. Some of these bodies show signs of violent death. Lindoman, found in England, had been struck on the head, strangled, and had his throat cut, a threefold death that suggests ritual rather than simple murder. Other bog bodies show similar patterns, wounds that seem excessive for merely killing someone, placement in bogs, which were sacred liminal spaces in Celtic cosmology. The implication is that these were sacrifices, offerings to gods of the earth or water. But how common was this? The bog bodies number in dozens, not thousands, spread across centuries, across a vast geographic area. If human sacrifice was regular, frequent, occurring at every major festival as some Roman sources suggest, we should find more evidence. The scarcity might mean it was rare, reserved for extreme circumstances, a failed harvest requiring desperate measures, a plague requiring appeasement, a major war requiring divine favour, purchased at the highest price. Context matters. Many cultures, including Rome itself in earlier periods, practiced human sacrifice under specific circumstances. The Romans had stopped by the time they encountered the Celts, or at least had relegated it to such rare occasions as to be effectively ended. From their new position of assumed civilization, they looked back at their own past and at contemporary barbarians with horror. But that horror was partly rhetorical, a way of defining themselves as superior as justified in conquest. The Druids, as priests, would have conducted any sacrifices that occurred. They would have spoken the words, made the offerings, interpreted the results. This gave the Romans a target. Suppressing the Druids meant suppressing human sacrifice, a noble goal that justified harsh measures. Whether the connection was as strong as claimed, whether human sacrifice was as prevalent as described, these questions served Roman purposes regardless of their truth. We should also consider that Celtic practices may have evolved over time. Earlier periods might have included human sacrifice that later periods had largely abandoned, or regional variation might have been significant, some tribes practicing what others found abhorrent. Caesar describes the Gauls as having given up many of their more extreme practices under pressure, suggesting change was already underway before Roman conquest. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. Human sacrifice probably occurred, The archaeological evidence supports it. The consistency of Roman accounts, despite their bias, suggests a foundation of truth. But the scale, frequency, and exact nature remain debatable. The Romans may have encountered real practices and then exaggerated them. Or they may have heard rumours, seen ritual objects they misunderstood, and constructed atrocity narratives from fragments. What we can say is that Celtic religion, like most ancient religions, involved blood sacrifice. Animals were killed ritually throughout the year. The practice was normal, expected, uncontroversial. The step from animal to human sacrifice is not small, but neither is it incomprehensible in the context of ancient belief systems. The gods required feeding. The greatest gifts won the greatest favour. In times of desperation, when lesser offerings had failed, the ultimate gift might seem necessary. The Druids were not gentle philosophers wandering peacefully through oak groves. They were priests of a religion that understood the world as requiring sacrifice, blood as a medium of exchange between human and divine. Whether they went so far as to sacrifice humans regularly or rarely, we cannot say with absolute certainty. But the possibility, even the likelihood, should not be dismissed simply because it troubles our modern sensibilities or disrupts romantic images of Celtic spirituality. Sacred animals and omens. The boundary between human and animal was not as clear in Celtic thought as it became in later Christian theology. Animals possessed power, wisdom, connection to the divine that humans could access through careful observation and proper relationship. The Druids and Vates studied animals intensely, reading their behaviours as texts written by the gods themselves. Birds were especially significant. They moved between earth and sky, crossing the boundary that humans could not cross. Their flight patterns carried meaning. A raven circling over a proposed battle site might suggest death or victory, depending on direction and number. Crows gathering predicted change, possibly danger. The harsh call of the raven was the voice of the war goddess in some regions. To hear it at certain times, in certain ways, was omen and warning both. The eagle, rare and magnificent, represented power and farsight. Its appearance was always significant. The hawk, common but no less sacred, could be observed regularly. Its hunting patterns analysed, its success or failure in catching prey interpreted as signs about human endeavours. Waterfowl, especially swans and geese, had otherworldly associations. Swans, with their white plumage and graceful movement, were sometimes thought to be people from the seed in transformed shape. To harm one risked terrible consequences. The wren, tiny but bold, had its own sacred status. There are hints in later tradition of a wren ritual, hunting the bird at specific times, though the details and meaning are obscured by centuries of transmission through cultures that had lost the original context. Size did not determine significance. The smallest bird might carry messages as important as the largest. The boar was sacred, associated with warfare, feasting, and the forest itself. Boar hunts were not merely practical food gathering, but ritual activities, tests of courage, engagements with a dangerous and powerful animal that embodied wild masculine energy. The image of the boar appeared on shields, helmets, banners, torques, and other prestige objects. To kill a great boar brought honour. To eat boar meat at feasts was to partake in its strength. The horse held special status, associated with sovereignty and with goddesses of the land. The famous white horse, carved into the chalk hills at Uffington, visible for miles, may date to Celtic times, a massive devotional image declaring connection between a particular people and the divine power of the horse. Horse sacrifice, rare but documented, was part of kingship rituals in some regions. The king's legitimacy derived partly from his relationship to the goddess of sovereignty, sometimes represented by or associated with a mare. The salmon embodied wisdom, Especially in Irish tradition, the salmon of knowledge appears in multiple myths, a fish that has eaten hazelnuts from sacred trees, thereby gaining all the world's knowledge. To eat this salmon, or even to be splashed by its cooking juices, transferred that wisdom. The myth reflects reality. Salmon were important food sources, returning annually to rivers in predictable patterns, connecting sea and fresh water, embodying the cyclical nature of existence. Their life cycle, spawn to ocean to river, return to death, to next generation, mirrored larger patterns of death and rebirth. The stag, lord of the forest, represented male potency and the wild spaces beyond human settlement. Horned gods appear in Celtic iconography, human figures with stag antlers, suggesting fluidity between human and animal form, or divine beings whose nature encompassed both. The hunt for the stag was transformative, carrying hunters deep into the woods, into liminal spaces where normal rules weakened and contact with the otherworld became possible. Cattle were wealth, status, the medium of exchange. Cattle raids were the primary form of warfare for many tribes. The bull's strength and fertility made it sacred, appropriate for sacrifice at important rituals. The cow's provision of milk made her sacred in different ways, giver of sustenance, the mother figure at the level of species. Gods and goddesses had cattle in the myths, herds that never diminished, that represented inexhaustible divine provision. The Druids and Vates watched all these creatures, interpreting their appearances, their behaviours, their deaths. A stag, seen in a particular place at a particular time, might indicate that hunting would be good, or that travel in that direction was favoured by the gods, or that a chief's decision was correct. Birds flying from the right or the left, across one's path or away from it, all meant different things. Animals acting unusually, appearing in strange places, behaving in ways that violated normal patterns. These were always significant, requiring interpretation, possibly requiring ritual response. Divination through animal sacrifice was practiced, though details are sketchy. After an animal was killed, its entrails were examined, the liver's shape and colour, the intestines' configuration, blood patterns. From these physical signs, the Vates drew conclusions about future events, about divine approval or displeasure, about hidden threats or unseen opportunities. This was not arbitrary. It was a systematic study, patterns memorized across generations, a language of flesh and blood that those trained could read. The relationship was reciprocal. Animals received respect, offerings, ritual acknowledgement. Sacred animals could not be harmed casually. Even non-sacred animals required proper treatment, proper words spoken when taking their lives. Everything was connected in the Celtic worldview. Animals were not mere resources to be exploited, but fellow beings, possessing their own forms of consciousness, their own connections to divine powers. To live properly in the world meant understanding these connections, honouring them, maintaining right relationship with the animal powers that shared the land with humans. Between the worlds, you stand at the mouth of the cave. Behind you, the world is ordinary, familiar, the sounds of your settlement faintly audible, even at this distance. Voices, dogs, the thunk of an axe biting wood, all the comfortable noises of human life. But ahead, darkness. The cave mouth yawns like an entrance to nothing, cold air breathing out of it, carrying scents of earth and moisture and something else, something you cannot quite name. This is the day you have prepared for. You are not a child anymore, not quite an adult either, but in the space between, and this ritual will mark the crossing. You have fasted, you have purified yourself in the stream, you wear no ornament, carry no weapon, just a simple woolen tunic and your bare feet against cold stone. The druid who has guided you to this place stands beside you. He is old, his face a landscape of wrinkles, his eyes pale but somehow seeing more than younger eyes do. He has been in this cave. He knows what waits. He has survived, or you would not be here with him. But knowing he survived does not make your heart beat less rapidly. He speaks quietly. The words are formal, ancient, phrases passed down through generations of initiations. He tells you that you must enter alone, that you must go deep, deeper than you think you can bear, until you find the pool. You will know it when you see it. And there, in the darkness and the silence, you must wait. The gods will speak, or they will not. You will see, or you will not. But you must wait until dawn, when the first light touches the hills outside, and only then may you return. You nod. Your throat is too tight for speech. He places one hand briefly on your shoulder, a gesture of encouragement or blessing or farewell. Then he steps back. You are alone with the darkness. You enter. The cave mouth swallows you immediately. The light from outside penetrates only a few paces before failing, defeated by accumulated shadow. You move slowly, hands outstretched, touching rough stone walls, feeling your way. The floor slopes downward. Your feet, already cold, feel every irregularity in the rock. Water drips somewhere ahead, an irregular plop, plop, plop that echoes strangely. How long do you walk? Minutes? Hours? Time becomes meaningless. There is no light to judge by, no sound but your own breathing, and the occasional drip of water and the whisper of air moving through stone passages. You begin to doubt, is this the right direction? Have you somehow taken a wrong turning? Is there even a pool? Or was that part of the test, sending you searching for something that does not exist? But then you smell it. Water? Yes, but different from rain or stream water. Mineral-rich, ancient, and the air changes, becomes more open. Your hands no longer touch walls. You are in a larger space. You lower yourself to sit. The stone is cold, achingly cold, but you settle into it, accepting the discomfort. Your eyes are open but see nothing. Not blackness, exactly. Something deeper than black. An absence so complete that sight itself becomes meaningless. You could have your eyes closed or open, and no difference would be detectable. The silence grows. You hear your pulse in your ears. Your breathing sounds loud, intrusive. You try to quiet it, try to become still. This is what was asked. Wait, be present, be open, let the boundaries thin. Time passes. Your back aches from sitting. Your legs grow numb. The cold seeps deep into your bones. You begin to shiver. You think of leaving, of claiming you waited long enough, of giving up. But shame keeps you in place. And something else. A growing sense that you are not alone. Nothing visible, nothing audible, but a presence, or multiple presences. Watching perhaps, or simply being, existing in this space that belongs to them more than to you. You are the intruder here, the visitor to a realm that normally excludes the living. The other world is close, pressing against the thin membrane of reality, and in this cave, that membrane is thinner than anywhere else. You see things that are not there. Or perhaps they are there, but only visible when ordinary sight has been stripped away by darkness and cold and isolation. Shapes that move at the edge of vision, though in darkness there should be no vision at all. Sounds that might be voices, might be water, might be the earth itself, shifting in its ancient slow dance. Fear comes. Real, primal fear. The kind that makes animals flee, makes hearts race, makes every instinct scream danger. You are in the earth's belly. You are vulnerable. You are separated from everything safe and known. If you died here, it would be days before they found you. If they found you at all, generations might pass, and your bones would lie in darkness, becoming part of the stone itself. But you breathe through the fear. You accepted this. You came willingly. The fear is part of the teaching. Death is always close. The other world is always near. To become an adult, to take your place in the community, you must understand this, must face it, must learn to exist with the knowledge that the visible world is not the only world, that other powers move through existence alongside humans, that respect and caution and proper ritual are not mere customs, but necessary protections. Gradually, imperceptibly, something changes. The fear does not disappear, but it transforms, becomes awe, wonder. You are sitting in the earth's body, in a place older than your tribe, older than the Celts themselves, older than humans perhaps. The stone around you was ancient when the world was young. The water in the pool has moved through passages unmapped, carrying dissolved minerals, tasting the rock's essence. You are part of something vast, something that will continue long after you are gone. The gods do not speak in words. No voice echoes in the darkness, but you understand something nonetheless, a sense of connection, of being seen, of being accepted into a knowledge that cannot be taught, only experienced. You have crossed the threshold. You have entered the between place and survived. You are changed. Far away, impossible to judge distance or direction, you hear the Druid's voice calling, "Dawn. Morning has come, you can return." You stand, stiff and cold, and make your way toward the sound, toward the light that you can now barely perceive, a faint grey suggestion of the cave mouth. When you emerge, the sunlight is blinding. The ordinary world shocks with its colour, its warmth, its noise. But you are not the same person who entered. You have been between the worlds. You have touched the sacred. And that touch will remain with you, a secret knowledge, a private understanding, for the rest of your days. The Gallic Wars. Gaius Julius Caesar was many things. Brilliant military commander, skilled politician, ambitious beyond measure. And, for the Celts of Gaul, he was the instrument of conquest, the man who would destroy their independence and bring them under Roman dominion. His account of the Gallic Wars, written partly as military report and partly as political propaganda, gives us our most detailed Roman perspective on the Druids, even as it describes their world being dismantled by military force. The war began in 58 BC and lasted 8 years. 8 years of campaigning, of battles and sieges, of massacre and enslavement. Caesar was systematic. He defeated the Celtic tribes one by one, sometimes making alliances with some to help conquer others, exploiting the political fragmentation that made the Celts militarily vulnerable despite their individual valour. By the war's end, hundreds of thousands were dead. More were enslaved. Gaul was Roman. And Celtic culture, while not eliminated, was forever changed. Forced to accommodate itself to imperial domination, in the midst of describing battles and political manoeuvring, Caesar includes ethnographic passages. He is curious about the peoples he is conquering, or at least wants his Roman readers to understand what kind of enemy they face. And he devotes attention to the Druids, recognizing them as significant, powerful, worthy of detailed description. He notes their exemption from military service. While warriors fought and died, the Druids remained apart, non-combatants, their persons theoretically sacred even in the midst of war. This was practical for them, preserving the learned class regardless of which tribe won which battle. But it also created a class that maintained continuity across political upheaval, that could remember before the war and carry knowledge into whatever came after. Caesar describes annual gatherings of Druids at a sacred site in the territory of the Carnutes, roughly the centre of Gaul. Druids from all tribes assembled there to hear legal cases, to share knowledge, to maintain the unity of their institution across political boundaries. This gathering was sacred, inviolable. Disputes between tribes might rage, but the Druids' assembly continued, a space of neutrality, a recognition that something transcended petty political conflicts. He mentions that the Druidic institution originated in Britain, and that Gauls seeking the deepest wisdom travelled across the Channel to study there. Whether this was true or represented Caesar's understanding based on limited information, we cannot be certain. But Britain, never conquered by Caesar despite 2 expeditions, remained independent, a place where Druidic practice could continue without Roman interference. This made it dangerous from Rome's perspective, a source of potential resistance. A place where traditions Rome wanted to eliminate could survive and spread back into conquered territories. Caesar also describes human sacrifice, presenting it as regular Druidic practice. He portrays the Druids as superintending the burning of criminals and prisoners of war in wicker figures, offering them to the gods for the community's benefit. This served his narrative. It made the Gauls seem barbaric, their religion cruel, Roman conquest a civilizing mission, but it also suggests he encountered this practice, or heard about it from sources he considered credible. The Druids appear in Caesar's account as both scholars and sinister figures. He respects their learning, their legal role, their organizational sophistication, but he also presents them as obstacles to Roman order, as representatives of a religion Rome could not tolerate, as dangerous because they commanded loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries. If Rome was to rule Gaul effectively, the Druids' power had to be broken. And broken it was, though not immediately. The conquest of Gaul did not end Druidism overnight, but it began the process. Roman administrators followed the armies. Roman law slowly replaced Celtic law. Roman religion was promoted, sometimes forcibly. The Druids found their role diminishing, their authority challenged, their independence threatened. Some adapted, finding ways to function within the new order. Some withdrew to regions Rome had not yet conquered. Some simply faded away, the last generation of a dying tradition. Caesar's wars transformed the Celtic world. The independence that had allowed Druidism to flourish, that had maintained the sacred groves and the annual gatherings and the transmission of knowledge across generations. This independence was ending. The Druids had preserved Celtic culture through centuries of tribal warfare and political change, but they could not preserve it against Rome's systematic conquest and cultural assimilation. The world Caesar describes in his commentaries was already disappearing, even as he wrote about it, the victim of the very campaigns his account celebrates, the last stronghold. The island was sacred, had been sacred for generations beyond counting. Anglesey, the Romans called it Mona. To the Celts, it was simply holy, a place where the gods drew close, where the Druids gathered, where the old ways were preserved most purely. It was refuge and fortress both, separated from the mainland by a narrow strait that could be treacherous, that provided natural defence, that marked a boundary between the occupied lands and the places Rome had not yet subdued. By 61 AD, much of Britain had been conquered. Roman legions had invaded under Claudius in 43 AD, and in the years since, they had pushed westward and northward, defeating tribal resistance, establishing forts and roads, beginning the process of Romanization. But the Druids had retreated before them, withdrawing to the edges of empire, to places where their authority still held, where the sacred groves remained uncut, where the old religion could still be practiced openly. Anglesey became their centre. Druids from across Britain gathered there, along with warriors from tribes still resisting Roman domination. The island had its own inhabitants, the Ordovices, a tribe that had not submitted, that provided sanctuary and support to those fleeing Roman rule. Together, they made Anglesey a symbol of resistance, a place that represented what Rome had not yet destroyed, a living reminder that Celtic independence still existed, however precariously. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, decided this could not stand. Anglesey was a military threat, certainly a base for raids and a rallying point for resistance. But it was more than that. It was a religious centre, the heart of Druidism, the place where the old religion maintained its strongest hold. To conquer Anglesey would be to strike at Celtic identity itself, to eliminate the spiritual leadership that gave resistance its coherence and determination. In 61 AD, Suetonius assembled his forces, legionaries, disciplined Roman infantry, auxiliary troops, soldiers from conquered tribes forced into Roman service, cavalry. ships to cross the strait. This was to be a decisive blow, not just military conquest but cultural destruction. Tacitus preserves the account, written decades later, but based on reports from witnesses. His prose is dramatic, theatrical, designed to emphasize Roman valor against terrifying barbarian opposition. We must read it carefully, aware of its bias, its need to make the enemy seem formidable, so that victory seems glorious. But even filtered through Roman propaganda, the scene he describes is powerful. The Roman forces assembled on the mainland shore, looking across the strait to Anglesey. On the opposite shore, the enemy waited. Warriors, armed and ready, formed up for battle. But among them were others. Druids, Tacitus tells us, dressed in black, raising their hands toward heaven, calling down curses on the invaders. And women, wild-haired, running between the ranks like furies from Greek mythology, shrieking, torches in their hands. The Romans hesitated. These were experienced soldiers, veterans of multiple campaigns. They had faced shield walls and cavalry charges and desperate sieges. But this was different. This was religion weaponized, the sacred turned against them, curses and prayers, and the concentrated will of a dying culture focused entirely on their destruction. For a moment, they stood frozen, unnerved by the spectacle. Then their commanders rallied them. Shame at their fear. Mockery of superstition. Appeals to Roman discipline and Roman superiority. The spell broke. The soldiers advanced, crossing the strait in boats and on rafts, the cavalry swimming alongside their horses. The water was cold, the current difficult, but they made it across, and then they crashed into the defenders, and battle began. The outcome was never in doubt. Roman military organization and training overwhelmed Celtic ferocity. The warriors fought desperately, knowing what defeat meant, but they could not hold. They died. They broke. They fled into the interior of the island, and the Romans pursued, showing little mercy. But the soldiers' real work came after the battle. Suetonius ordered the sacred groves cut down, every oak, every ash, every tree that had stood in the Nemetons. These were to be felled, the wood burned, the sacred spaces destroyed. Soldiers moved through the groves with axes. The Druids' curses meant nothing now. The gods, if they were present, did not intervene. The trees fell, the great ancient oaks crashing down. Their wood split for fires that would consume the altars and the ritual objects and anything else that marked this place as holy. Tacitus mentions groves stained with human blood, altars where captives had been sacrificed. This may be true. It may be exaggeration, justifying the destruction by emphasizing barbarian cruelty. But true or false, the groves burned. The stones were scattered. The centre of Druidic practice in Britain was being deliberately, systematically erased. Some Druids died fighting. Some were captured and killed afterward. Some escaped, fleeing to Ireland or Scotland, to lands Rome would never conquer. But Anglesey, as a Druidic centre, was finished. The Romans established control. They built their own structures. They imposed their own order, and the sacred island became just another conquered territory. Its special status acknowledged only in memory, in stories told by survivors, in the knowledge of what had been lost. The destruction of Anglesey was not the end of Druidism. The tradition survived in areas beyond Roman reach. It adapted in areas under Roman control, becoming less visible, less public, but not entirely eliminated. But it was a critical blow, a demonstration that Rome could strike at the heart of Celtic religion and face no divine retribution. The Druids' power had failed. Their curses had not stopped the axes. Their gods had not protected the sacred groves. And if the gods could not protect even their holiest places, what did that mean for the faith of those who had believed in them? The Lindo Man. On the 1st of August, 1984, workers cutting peat in a bog near Manchester, England, uncovered something that stopped their work immediately. a human foot preserved in the peat, still wearing soft leather around the ankle. They called the police. The police called archaeologists. And gradually, carefully, the body was excavated. What emerged was a man who had died approximately 2,000 years ago, his body preserved by the unique chemistry of the bog, his story written in the manner of his death. They called him Lindo Man, after the place of his discovery. He was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, well-built, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and moustache. His hands were smooth, uncalloused, suggesting he did not perform heavy manual labour. His fingernails were manicured. This was not a peasant, not a common worker. This was someone of status, someone whose life had been comfortable, whose body showed care and grooming that marked him as special. But he had died horribly. The peat had preserved the evidence of his final moments with terrible clarity. He had been struck twice on the head with a heavy object, blows hard enough to fracture the skull. A cord had been placed around his neck and tightened, strangling him. His throat had been cut, and then his body had been placed face down in the bog, held under by a wooden stake or branches, ensuring he would not surface, would not be disturbed. This threefold death, repeated trauma beyond what was needed to simply kill someone, suggested ritual. Sacrifice, not murder. The blows to the head might have been symbolic, dedicating him to a god associated with the skull or the mind. The strangling connected him to the sky, to the breath, to the wind and air deities. The throat cutting drew blood, feeding the earth, connecting him to the chthonic powers of below. 3 deaths for 3 realms, 3 offerings to 3 aspects of the divine. Examination of his stomach contents revealed his last meal. A simple mixture of grains, slightly charred, consumed hours before his death. Some scholars have suggested this was a ritual meal, special bread made only for sacrifice victims. Others argue it was simply food, nothing necessarily sacred about it. But the very plainness of it, after evidence of an otherwise privileged life, raises questions. Was he fasting? Was this a ceremonial preparation? His body had been carefully placed in the bog. This was not casual disposal. Bogs were sacred, liminal spaces where earth and water merged, where the ordinary world touched the other world. To place a sacrifice in a bog was to deliver it directly to the divine powers, to ensure the offering reached its intended recipients. The location was as important as the method of death. Why was he killed? We can only speculate. The timing of his death, approximately the 1st century AD, places him in the period of Roman conquest of Britain. Was this a desperate offering, a plea to the gods to protect the people from the invaders? Was he a volunteer, perhaps a druid himself, choosing to die to save his community? Was he a criminal, executed in a way that turned punishment into religious offering? Was he simply unlucky, selected by lot or by some characteristic we cannot now identify? His smooth hands, his grooming, his apparent status, all suggest someone important. Some scholars have theorized he was a druid. The care of his death, the ritual elements, the threefold pattern, all align with what we know about druidic religious practice. If human sacrifice occurred, and the Romans insist it did, then the victims might have been criminals or captives or, in the most extreme circumstances, willing volunteers from the highest ranks of society. A druid sacrificing himself to save his people would make sense within Celtic values of honour, duty, community responsibility, but we cannot know. We cannot interview him, cannot ask why he went to his death, cannot determine whether he was victim or volunteer, criminal or hero. The peat preserved his body, but not his story. We are left with forensic evidence, with the physical facts of his death, and with speculation about meaning. What Lindo Man gives us is confirmation that the Romans were not entirely inventing when they described Celtic sacrifice. Human sacrifice occurred, the archaeological evidence, not just Lindoman but other bog bodies across Celtic territories, supports this. The practice was real, but the context, the frequency, the exact religious significance, these remain debatable. He lies now in the British Museum, a brown leather thing that was once a man, his face still recognisable, his beard still visible, his last meal still in his gut. Visitors pass by, looking at him through glass, this young man who died so long ago, who was struck and strangled, and cut and placed in water and earth, who became an offering to gods whose names we no longer know with certainty. His death was meant to save his people, but his people were conquered anyway. The gods did not intervene. The Romans came, and the sacred groves burned, and the Druids fled, or died or adapted. And this young man, preserved by accident of chemistry, became a silent witness to a faith that could not save itself, let alone save those who believed in it. Resistance and retreat. The Conquest did not kill Druidism instantly. Empires rarely work that way. They conquer territory, establish control, impose laws, but cultural change happens slowly, generation by generation, through pressure and inducement, and the gradual realization that the old ways are no longer viable. The Druids had survived tribal warfare, political upheaval, centuries of change. They adapted now as they had always adapted, finding ways to continue, even in diminished form, even under hostile rule. The Roman emperors issued edicts. Tiberius and Claudius both issued measures against the Druids, specifically targeting their practices. Roman citizenship was denied to those who participated in Druidic religion. The sacred groves were desecrated or cut down. Human sacrifice, if it continued, was prosecuted as murder. The public role of Druids as judges was eliminated, replaced by Roman law and Roman courts. Taxation replaced the tribute system that had supported Druids. Latin began displacing Celtic languages in official contexts, but edicts are one thing, enforcement another. In remote areas, in places where Roman control was thin, the old practices continued. A grove might be cut down officially, reported destroyed, while Druids quietly maintained other sites deeper in the forest, known only to the initiated. Sacrifices might move from public to private, conducted in secret, the community protecting its priests from Roman authorities. The annual gatherings might be abandoned, too visible, too vulnerable. But smaller meetings continued, knowledge still transmitted, initiations still performed. Some Druids withdrew geographically, moving to territories Rome had not conquered. Ireland, never touched by Roman legions, became a haven. Scotland, beyond Hadrian's Wall, remained largely free. In these places, Druidism continued openly, evolving on its own trajectory, maintaining traditions that were dying in the occupied lands. But cut off from the larger Celtic world, isolated in islands and highlands, the tradition fragmented. Regional variations became more pronounced. The unity that had made Druidism a force across all Celtic peoples weakened. Others adapted. They accepted Roman rule as inevitable and found ways to function within it. They might no longer judge legal cases, but they could still teach, still preserve genealogies, still function as poets and advisors to tribal leaders who had become Roman clients. The religious role diminished, replaced by Roman priests serving Roman gods, but the cultural role persisted. Memory keepers, tradition preservers, links to a past that was slipping away but not yet entirely gone. Syncretism occurred, the blending of Celtic and Roman religious practices. Celtic gods were identified with Roman equivalents, given Latin names, worshipped in Roman-style temples. The Gaulish god Lugus became Mercury Lugus. The goddess Sulis, associated with the hot springs at Bath, became Sulis Minerva. The forms changed, Roman architecture, replacing sacred groves, written dedications, replacing oral prayers. But underneath, Celtic beliefs persisted, adapted, wearing Roman clothes but retaining Celtic identity. The Druids, as a distinct class, were diminishing. Each generation, fewer young people undertook the 20-year training. Why invest in becoming a Druid when Druids had lost their legal role, their political influence, their religious monopoly? Better to learn Latin, to enter Roman service, to adapt to the new order. The chain of transmission, oral, and therefore vulnerable, began breaking. Knowledge was lost, not destroyed violently, but simply forgotten, not passed on, dying with the old men who held it. But even as the institution crumbled, elements persisted. The respect for poetry, the importance of genealogy, the seasonal festivals, transformed but recognizable. The sacred wells, now dedicated to Christian saints but still visited, still believed to have special power. The stories, myths about heroes and gods, preserved now in different contexts, no longer part of religious practice but still told, still remembered. In the occupied territories, Druidism as an organized religion was effectively over by the 2nd or 3rd century AD. The last Druids died, their knowledge incomplete, the tradition interrupted. Roman victory was total, but it was not annihilation. Seeds survived. In Ireland, in Scotland, in the stories and customs of conquered peoples, in the landscape itself, where sacred sites remained sacred even when their original purposes were forgotten. Rome had broken Druidic power, but it could not entirely erase Druidic influence that would persist, underground, transformed, adapted, for centuries to come. The Druids as priests and judges and teachers were gone, but the Druids as memory, as symbol, as part of Celtic identity, these could not be killed by edicts or military conquest. They would return, in different forms, when conditions allowed. The tradition was interrupted, not ended. Sleeping, not dead, beyond the wall. The north is different, has always been different. Rome controls the south, has built its roads and towns and villas, imposed its law and language and gods. But here, beyond the wall, beyond the great stone barrier Hadrian built to mark the limit of empire, the old ways continue, modified perhaps but unbroken, living still. Picture Scotland in the 2nd century AD. Mountains dark against grey skies, glens carved deep by ancient glaciers, rivers cold and fast flowing to the sea, forests of oak and pine and birch, older than Rome, older than memory. Lochs reflecting clouds, their surfaces disturbed by rain, stone circles standing silent on hilltops, raised by peoples who came before the Celts, honoured still because sacred places remain sacred, whoever made them. The tribes here never submitted. They raided south, testing the wall's defences, taking cattle and slaves and whatever else they could carry. Rome raided north in return. Punitive expeditions that burned villages and slaughtered warriors, but never conquered, never held. The land itself resisted. Too wild, too poor, too difficult to supply an occupying force. Better to build a wall, to mark the boundary, to defend south of it, and let the north remain barbarian, unconquered, Roman but not Roman, acknowledged as beyond the pale. The Druids who fled here found acceptance. The tribes knew them, respected them, needed them. Without Druids, who would judge disputes? Who would maintain the calendar, conduct the rituals, preserve the genealogies and laws? Rome's conquest of the south had created a diaspora of learned men, and the northern tribes received them, gave them place and purpose, allowed them to continue teaching, training new generations in the old knowledge. In Ireland, even safer, even more remote, the tradition flourished. No Romans had ever landed there in force. No legions had burned the groves. The sacred sites remained untouched. The seasonal festivals occurred on schedule. The Druids taught openly, initiated new students, maintained the full complexity of their tradition without compromise or adaptation to foreign rule. Picture a grove on the western coast of Ireland. Evening, the sun setting over the Atlantic, painting sky and sea in shades of orange and gold and deepening blue. The Druids gather. They are here for the festival, for Samhain, the year's turning. Fires are lit, cattle are driven between them. The community assembles, families and individuals, the whole clan together for this most important of nights. The Druids speak the ancient words. They have been speaking them for generations, for centuries. The words are power. The words maintain order. The words connect earth and heaven, human and divine, present and past and future. The words are the same words their teachers spoke, and their teachers before them, reaching back through time to the first Druids, who learned to speak to the gods. The rituals proceed. Offerings are made. Prayers are spoken. Divination is performed, reading signs for the winter ahead. Stories are told, myths recited, genealogies confirmed. Children watch, learning, absorbing through repeated exposure the shape of the tradition they will carry forward. This is normal here, not resistance, not survival against odds, just normal practice of normal religion in a land where it has always been practiced. The night deepens. Stars appear where clouds allow. The fires burn lower. People drift to sleep, some in their homes, some wrapped in cloaks near the dying flames. The Druids remain awake longer, speaking among themselves in quiet voices, discussing matters of law and law, questions that have arisen, interpretations that need clarifying. They are the continuity. They are the memory. As long as they persist, the tradition persists, and it will persist here for centuries. Yet, Rome will fall. Christianity will come, slowly, peacefully, in Ireland's case, not imposed by conquest but adopted through persuasion and gradual conversion. The Druids will not vanish even then, but will transform, becoming the Fili, the learned class of Christian Ireland, poets and historians who preserve the old stories, even as they serve the new faith. But that transformation is still future. For now, in the firelight, under stars that have watched countless such gatherings, the Druids practice their art unchanged, unbroken, living proof that what Rome destroyed in the south remains vital here beyond its reach, beyond its power to diminish or erase. The wind carries smoke inland. The Atlantic murmurs its eternal rhythm. The land sleeps under darkness, and in the grove, the old words are spoken, as they have been spoken, as they will be spoken, as long as anyone remembers. The Irish sanctuary. Ireland had always been different. The Romans never came. No legions marched through its valleys. No governors imposed foreign law. No engineers built roads in straight Roman lines. The island remained apart, Celtic and proud, maintaining its own course while the continent transformed under Roman rule. And this independence preserved something precious, something that was dying elsewhere. The Druidic tradition continued in Ireland, not in hiding, not in diminished form, but openly, fully, as it had been practiced for centuries. The Irish Druids were called Drui in their own language. They held the same roles their continental cousins had held before conquest: judges between tribes, advisors to kings, teachers of the noble young, priests conducting ceremonies at the sacred times. They maintained the calendar. They memorized law and genealogy. They spoke with the authority of tradition behind them, unbroken tradition, an uninterrupted chain of transmission, reaching back through generations to origins lost in antiquity. The social structure of Celtic Ireland remained intact. The tribal kingdoms, the warrior aristocracy, the threefold division of society into those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The Druids occupied the highest rank of the learned class, above the poets and satirists and historians, though the boundaries between these roles were fluid, overlapping, with Druids often functioning as poets and poets sometimes called Drui. They presided at the great assemblies, the Onach, where law was pronounced and disputes judged. They stood beside kings at inaugurations, speaking the words that made kingship legitimate, that connected the mortal ruler to the goddess of sovereignty that bound king and land together in sacred relationship. Without Druidic blessing, a king's authority was questionable. With it, his rule had divine sanction. The seasonal festivals continued unchanged. Samhain and Imbolc, Beltane and Lughnasadh, marking the wheels turning as they always had. The Druids calculated the proper times, led the rituals, spoke the prayers that maintained cosmic order. Communities gathered at sacred sites, hilltops and groves and ancient earthworks, participating in ceremonies that their ancestors had participated in, that their descendants would continue, creating continuity across time, linking past and future through present practice. But Ireland was changing, slowly, in ways that would transform everything. Christianity was arriving, not through conquest, not imposed by force, but through peaceful mission, through persuasion, through the slow work of monks and bishops who came to convert, who brought literacy and Latin learning, and a new understanding of the divine. The confrontation between Druids and Christians was coming, inevitable, though it would be less violent, less absolute than what had happened under Rome. Ireland would find ways to preserve, even as it converted, to maintain connection to its past, even as it accepted a new future. The Druids did not know yet that their tradition's days as an organised religion were numbered. They continued teaching, initiating, judging, praying. They maintained the groves and conducted the sacrifices and spoke the ancient words. They were the living link to the ancestors, the preservers of identity, the voice of tradition, and in Ireland, uniquely in the Celtic world, they could practice openly, completely, without fear or compromise, for a little while longer. The sun was setting on their world, but in Ireland, it was a long, gentle sunset, not the violent extinguishing that had occurred elsewhere. Time remained, not forever, but enough to make a difference, enough to ensure that something would survive into the new age that was coming. The Fili and the monks. The transformation was gradual, stretching across centuries, peaceful where it might have been violent, preserving where it might have destroyed. Christianity came to Ireland in the 5th century, traditionally brought by Patrick, though certainly others contributed. And with Christianity came literacy, the art of writing that the Druids had deliberately avoided for their sacred knowledge. The collision between oral tradition and written word, between pagan and Christian, might have been catastrophic. Instead, it became something stranger, more complex, a synthesis, a preservation. The Druids did not simply disappear. The tradition adapted, transformed, found new forms while maintaining essential continuities. Some Druids converted, becoming Christian monks, bringing their training and knowledge into the new religion. Others continued in secular roles, their religious functions diminished or eliminated, but their cultural importance maintained. They became the Fili, the learned poets and historians of medieval Ireland, a class that combined elements of the old bardic tradition with new Christian learning. The Fili were not Druids exactly. They did not conduct pagan rituals or speak for pagan gods, but they maintained aspects of Druidic function. They memorized genealogies, preserving tribal histories through oral tradition, even after writing became available. They composed poetry, using complex meters inherited from pre-Christian practice. They held legal knowledge, serving as advisors and judges. They trained for years, studying grammar and metrics and traditional law, a schooling that echoed the 20-year Druidic path in abbreviated form, and they preserved the myths. This is perhaps their greatest gift to us, the reason we know anything about Celtic religion beyond what Romans wrote. The Fili remembered the old stories. They recited them at gatherings. They taught them to students, and eventually, they allowed them to be written down, committed to parchment by Christian monks who saw value in preserving their people's heritage, even when that heritage was pagan. Why did the monks write these stories? They were Christians, servants of a religion that condemned pagan gods as demons or delusions. Yet they spent hours, days, Years copying tales about the Tuatha De Danann, about druids working magic, about gods and goddesses whose worship Christianity explicitly opposed. The motivation was complex. Partly, it was cultural pride. These were Irish stories, part of what made the Irish distinct from other peoples. Preserving them preserved identity. Partly, it was historical interest. The past mattered, even the pagan past, especially the pagan past, because it was their past, their ancestors' beliefs and deeds. But partly, the monks may have sensed that these stories contained truth of a different kind, not literal truth, not historical fact necessarily, but truth about human nature, about courage and loss and longing, and the relationship between people and the land they inhabited. The myths could be understood allegorically, morally, as teaching stories even when stripped of religious belief, and so they were copied, carefully, preserved in manuscripts that have survived through the centuries to bring us knowledge that would otherwise be lost completely. The monasteries became the new centres of learning, replacing the Druidic schools. Young men who in earlier times might have trained as Drui, now trained as monks and scribes. They learned Latin alongside Irish. They studied scripture and theology, but also traditional law and poetry. The curriculum blended Christian and pre-Christian elements, creating something uniquely Irish, a Christian culture that acknowledged and incorporated its pagan heritage rather than attempting to destroy it utterly. The transition was not without loss. The religious practices of Druidism, the actual rituals and ceremonies, and the theology underlying them, these largely vanished. We have stories about Druids, but we do not have Druidic liturgy. We know they worshipped, but we do not know precisely what words they spoke. The transformation from oral to written, from sacred secret to recorded story, changed the material fundamentally. Something essential was lost in that translation, but something was also gained. Without the Fili and the monks, we would have no Irish mythology at all. The stories would have died with the last pagans, lost like so much Celtic tradition was lost on the continent. Instead, we have the Tan Bo Cuainge, the cattle raid of Cooley. We have the Lebo Gabala Eren, the Book of Invasions. We have cycles of stories about gods and heroes, about druids and kings, about the sacred landscape of Ireland. Preserved by people who no longer believed in the gods described, written down by monks who served a different faith, but preserved nonetheless, a bridge across the chasm between pagan and Christian worlds. The Fili themselves persisted long into the Christian period, maintaining their social status, their economic support through patronage, their role as cultural authorities. As late as the 17th century, hereditary families of poets still functioned in Ireland, still trained in traditional metres, still preserved genealogies, still served the old function of praise and satire, though by then entirely within a Christian context. The line from ancient Druid to medieval Fili to early modern poet stretches unbroken, attenuated and transformed but continuous, a thread of tradition that survived conquest, conversion, cultural change, maintaining identity across a millennium, and more. Voices in manuscript. Brother Cormac bent over his work, squinting in the dim light of the scriptorium. His eyes ached. His fingers cramped around the quill. He had been copying for hours, would copy for hours more before the day ended. This was his life now, had been his life for 20 years, since he took his vows and entered the monastery, writing, copying, preserving. Today's work was different from the usual. Not scripture, not theology, not the lives of saints or commentaries on the fathers. Today he copied an old story, one told by the bards, about heroes and cattle raids, and the warrior queen Medeb. A pagan story, full of magic and violence and gods disguised as mortals. Brother Cormac felt uncomfortable with it, yet his abbot had assigned the task, so he proceeded. He paused, reading ahead to see what came next. A druid in the story was casting a spell, calling up a magical fog to confuse enemies. Cormac frowned. This was sorcery, clearly. Devil's work. Should such things be written? Should they be preserved for future generations to read? But the abbot had been clear. These stories were part of their heritage. Irish stories told by Irish voices about Irish heroes. Yes, they were pagan. Yes, they described practices the church condemned. But they were also history, of a kind, memory of how the ancestors had lived and thought and believed. To destroy them would be to cut themselves off from their own past, to pretend they had no history before Christ came to Ireland. Cormac dipped his quill, continued copying. The Latin letters formed slowly under his careful hand. He was translating as he wrote, putting Irish words into Latin script, making the oral tradition readable, permanent, no longer dependent on memory and repetition. This too made him uneasy. The old Druids had forbidden writing their sacred knowledge. They had good reasons, surely, though Cormac did not fully understand them. Was he violating something by committing these words to parchment? But the Druids were gone. The old religion was gone, replaced by the true faith. What harm could these stories do now? They were just tales, entertainment, moral lessons perhaps, about the dangers of pride or the rewards of loyalty. The gods mentioned in them were not real gods. They were demons, or they were simply fictional characters, no more real than the heroes of Greek mythology that Christian scholars studied without worry. He worked through the afternoon, through Vespers, into evening. Other monks came and went, working on their own assigned texts. The scriptorium was quiet, except for scratching quills and occasional whispers. This was holy work, they believed, even when copying pagan tales. Preserving knowledge, maintaining memory, ensuring that future generations would know what had been, would understand where they came from. When he finally finished the section, Cormac sat back, flexing his stiff fingers. The story sat before him in neat columns, permanent now, safe from the failure of memory. And despite his discomfort, he felt something like satisfaction. Yes, it was a pagan story, but it was also beautiful in its way. The language was vivid. The characters were compelling. The Queen Meb was fierce and admirable even in her pagan pride. The hero Cuchulainn was brave beyond measure. These were not Christians, but they were human, recognizable, their struggles and choices meaningful. Perhaps that was why the abbot wanted these stories preserved. Not for theology, not for religious instruction, but for humanity, to remember that the ancestors, even in their paganism, were people like themselves. Flawed, striving, caught between earth and heaven, trying to live with honor in a difficult world. The faith had changed, the gods had changed, but human nature remained constant, and these old stories reflected that constancy. Brother Cormac cleaned his quill, closed the inkpot, stood carefully. His back protested after hours bent over parchment. He whispered a prayer of thanks for the day's work, for the ability to read and write, for the monastery that gave him purpose. Tomorrow, he would continue. More stories waited, more heroes and druids and ancient battles. He would copy them all, faithfully, preserving what the old ones had known, building a bridge from past to present, ensuring that the voices of the ancestors would continue speaking, however changed, however transformed, into the future that was coming. The mythological cycle. The stories the monks preserved give us our closest glimpse into how the Druids might have understood their world, their gods, their sacred history. The mythology is complex, multi-layered, full of inconsistencies that reflect its oral origins and the variety of regional traditions that contributed to it. But certain patterns emerge, certain figures appear repeatedly, and through them we can begin to reconstruct something of the cosmology that the Druids taught. The Lebor Gabála Érenn, the Book of Invasions, presents a mythologized history of Ireland through successive waves of settlers, each replacing or absorbing the previous inhabitants. The most significant group, for our purposes, are the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They are described as beautiful, powerful, skilled in magic and crafts. They came to Ireland in clouds of mist, some versions say, bringing with them 4 magical treasures: the stone of Fal that cried out when the true king stood upon it, the spear of Luge that guaranteed victory, the sword of Nuada that none could escape once it was drawn, and the cauldron of the Dagda that could feed an army and never empty. The Tuatha De Danann fought battles against earlier inhabitants, the Fir Bolg and the Fomorians, monstrous beings associated with chaos and the sea. They established themselves as the divine or semi-divine rulers of Ireland, but their time was limited. Eventually, the Milesians came, mortal humans, ancestors of the Irish. War followed. The Tuatha De Danann were defeated, not entirely, but enough that they could no longer rule openly. They withdrew into the Seed, the hollow hills, the burial mounds scattered across the landscape. There they dwelt, in the otherworld, parallel to the mortal realm but separate, invisible, except when the barriers thinned or when they chose to appear. This mythological framework reflects religious belief transformed into story. The Tuatha De Danann were almost certainly gods, deities worshipped in pre-Christian Ireland, now euhemerized into quasi-historical figures to make them acceptable to Christian copyists. Their retreat into the Seed represents the transition from active worship to memory, from gods who were prayed to gods who became folklore, beings of story rather than beings of cult. The Druids appear throughout these tales as figures of power and knowledge. In the Ulster cycle, which tells of the hero Cuchulainn, the Druid Cathbad is a central figure. He is advisor to King Conchobar, teacher of young warriors, and prophet whose words shape events. When Cathbad predicts that a certain girl child will bring destruction to Ulster, the king keeps her in isolation, hoping to avert the prophecy. Of course, it comes true anyway, because prophecy in Celtic myth is inevitable, fate written by forces beyond mortal control. Cathbad demonstrates typical druidic abilities. He can predict the future through divination. He knows the proper rituals for various occasions. He can curse and bless with equal effectiveness. When warriors seek to know if a day is auspicious for battle, they consult Cathbad. When the king needs advice on matters of law or custom, Cathbad provides it. He is indispensable, the wise counsellor whose knowledge surpasses that of warriors and kings. Other druids in the myths display similar characteristics. They create magical fogs and illusions. They transform shapes, turning people into animals, or making themselves appear as different people. They brew potions that heal or harm. They speak incantations that compel obedience, or strike enemies dead. The line between what we would call natural magic, manipulation of herbs and psychology, and supernatural magic, violation of natural law, is blurry or non-existent in these stories. The Druids simply have power, and that power manifests in whatever ways the story requires. The goddess Brigid appears repeatedly, associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Her festival, Imbolc, marked the beginning of spring. She had a sacred flame that burned perpetually at Kildare, tended by priestesses, a practice that continued into Christian times, with the flame rededicated to Saint Brigid, who may herself be a Christianized version of the pagan goddess. The continuity is visible, the old religion transforming into the new while maintaining essential elements. The god Luch, master of all skills, appears in both Irish and continental Celtic sources. His name is preserved in place names like Lion and Leiden. His festival, Lunasad, celebrated harvest and kingship. He is associated with light, with sovereignty, with the sun's power. In the myths, he leads the Tuatha De Danann to victory over the Fomorians, using his multiple skills and talents to overcome monsters that had oppressed his people. The Dagda, the good god, is portrayed as a figure of abundance and protection. His cauldron feeds all who come to it. His club can kill with one end and resurrect with the other. He is crude sometimes, even comical, but also powerful, essential, the father figure of the pantheon. He mates with the Morrigan, the war goddess, in a river on Samhain, a ritual act that ensures the land's fertility and the tribe's success in battle. These figures and their stories give us glimpses into how the Druids might have taught religious concepts. The gods are not distant, not separate from the world, but active within it, interacting with humans, accessible through ritual and prayer. The other world is close, reachable through sacred sites and at sacred times. Magic is real, a manipulation of forces that pervade existence. Knowledge is power, and the Druids, as keepers of knowledge, are powerful. But we must remember, these are stories filtered through Christian scribes, written centuries after the Druids ceased functioning as priests of an active religion. How much is authentic pre-Christian belief? How much is Christian reinterpretation? How much is simply good storytelling, embellishment and invention for narrative effect? We cannot separate these layers completely. We are left with beautiful, compelling tales that hint at profound religious truths, but never quite reveal them fully. The mystery remains, even in the preservation. The Druids kept their secrets well, and even after their tradition ended, even after the stories were written, the deepest knowledge remained hidden, lost when the last oral links in the chain were broken. Standing stones and sacred wells. They stand across the landscape like witnesses to ages we can barely imagine. Stone circles, their massive blocks arranged in careful patterns, aligned sometimes with celestial events, with sunrise on the solstice or moonrise at the equinox. Dolmens, burial chambers of huge stones, capped with even larger capstones, entrances to the earth, doorways to the dead, standing stones, solitary sentinels on hilltops, marking sites whose significance has been forgotten but whose power can still be felt. The Druids did not build these. The stones are older, much older, raised by peoples who lived in these lands thousands of years before the Celts arrived. Yet the Druids almost certainly used them, recognized their power, incorporated them into their own religious practice. Sacred places tend to remain sacred across cultures, across millennia. The ancestors knew where the boundaries were thin, where earth and heaven touched, where the other world pressed close, and they marked those places with stone, with monuments that would endure, that would continue speaking long after the builders and their languages and their specific beliefs had vanished. Walk through the Irish countryside, and you will find them still, wells that have been holy for as long as anyone can remember. Some are officially Christian now, dedicated to Patrick or Bridget or other saints. But the practice of visiting them, of leaving offerings, of drinking the water for healing, this predates Christianity by centuries. The wells were sacred to the old gods first, the gods of water and earth, the goddesses of sovereignty and fertility. The names changed. The prayers changed. But the wells themselves remained holy. The water still believed to carry blessing, the site still visited by people seeking something beyond ordinary life. Cloth strips tied to trees near holy wells, coins dropped into the water, small stones carefully stacked. These offerings continue, a practice ancient beyond measuring, the human impulse to give something in exchange for blessing, to acknowledge the sacred with a token of respect and need. The Druids would have presided over such places, speaking the proper words, ensuring offerings were made correctly, interpreting what the wells might reveal about future or fate. Now people come without priests, the practice persisting through habit and folk memory, and a lingering sense that these places matter, that water from certain sources carries more than just chemical compounds. The landscape itself was sacred to the Celts, and that understanding has never entirely disappeared from Irish and Scottish and Welsh consciousness. Particular hills are still associated with the other world. Certain caves are still approached with caution. Trees growing alone, or in unusual configurations, are still noticed, still granted a kind of respect that has nothing to do with forestry or botany, and everything to do with something older, half forgotten but not gone. Celtic art survives in museums, in collections of metalwork and carved stone. The swirling patterns, the knotwork, the reluctance to depict recognizable humans or animals in favor of abstract designs, all this reflects a worldview where boundaries between things were fluid, where transformation was constant, where nothing was quite what it seemed at first glance. The art doesn't depict the gods directly but suggests them, hints at them, creates visual echoes of something beyond representation. The stones and wells and sacred hills. These are the physical traces of Druidic religion, not intentionally left. The Druids built no monuments to themselves, no temples declaring their theology. But they used what was already there, honoured it, maintained it, wove it into their practice, and those sites remain, outlasting the Druids by millennia, still carrying some residue of the sacred, still drawing people who may not believe in the old gods, but can feel nonetheless that these places are different, special, worthy of acknowledgement and respect. The Romantic Revival. For 1,000 years after the Druids disappeared, as an active religious institution, they were largely forgotten beyond Ireland and Wales, where oral traditions preserved their memory. European society became Christian, then began slowly secularizing. The Druids, when remembered at all, were footnotes in ancient Roman accounts, exotic curiosities from a barbaric past of little interest or relevance. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, something shifted. Intellectuals, poets, antiquarians began looking at their own pasts with new interest. Nationalism was rising. People wanted origin stories, wanted to connect themselves to ancient glories, wanted to claim heritage distinct from the classical Mediterranean civilizations that had dominated European imagination. And in Britain particularly, attention turned to the Celts, to the pre-Roman inhabitants, to the Druids who had resisted Rome's conquest. The Druids were reinvented, reimagined, transformed into symbols that had little to do with historical reality and everything to do with contemporary needs. They became noble savages, nature philosophers, proto-Christians practicing a pure monotheism before Christ arrived. They became astronomers who built Stonehenge, conducting sophisticated celestial observations from stone temples. They became mystical sages, preserving ancient wisdom that modern corruption had lost. One figure stands out in this romantic recreation. Edward Williams, who called himself Iolo Morganwg, claimed to possess authentic Druidic teachings, secret traditions preserved through Welsh bardic schools. He organised Druidic rituals at Stonehenge and other sites. He wrote poetry and prose, purporting to reveal ancient wisdom. He was persuasive, charismatic, and almost entirely fraudulent. Most of what he claimed about Druidic teaching was his own invention, created to support his vision of Welsh identity and Celtic spirituality. But his fabrications were enormously influential. They shaped how 19th and 20th century people understood the Druids. Organisations calling themselves Druidic orders formed, claiming continuity with ancient practice through Iolo's imagined lineages. Rituals he invented became traditional, repeated annually by people who believed they were following authentic ancient patterns. The modern Druidic movement, which continues today, owes more to Iolo Morganwg and other Romantic revivalists than to any genuine ancient tradition. This is not entirely their fault. The genuine tradition was lost, the oral transmission had been broken, the ancient Druids left no texts. What survived was fragments, hints, ambiguous archaeological evidence, and stories written by outsiders or by Christian monks centuries after the fact. Anyone claiming to practice authentic Druidism was necessarily reconstructing, imagining, filling vast gaps with educated guesses at best, pure invention at worst. The Victorian Druids in their white robes, gathering at Stonehenge for sunrise ceremonies, were not continuing ancient practice. They were creating new practice, inspired by romantic ideas about ancient practice. The distinction matters. Modern Druidry is a modern religion. drawing inspiration from perceived Celtic spirituality, but essentially contemporary in structure, belief, and practice. It has value for those who practice it, provides community and meaning and connection to nature. But it is not what the ancient Druids did, not a survival of that tradition, but something new wearing old names. The Romantic revival did generate renewed scholarly interest. Serious historians and archaeologists began studying the Celts, trying to separate fact from fantasy, examining evidence carefully, rather than spinning romantic tales. The field of Celtic studies developed, becoming academically respectable, producing careful research that has slowly, gradually, revised and corrected the wild claims of the antiquarians. We know far more now about the historical Druids than the Victorians did. But we also know how much we don't know, how many gaps can never be filled, how much was lost irrecoverably when the oral tradition died. What we've learned, modern archaeology has transformed our understanding. New methods, new technologies, new interpretive frameworks have allowed us to squeeze more information from limited evidence, to see patterns previous generations missed, to ask questions that couldn't be asked before. Radiocarbon dating has established precise chronologies, allowing us to place Celtic artifacts and sites in specific periods, to track movements and changes over time. We can now say with confidence that the stone circles predate the Celts, that certain bog bodies died in the 1st century AD, that particular settlements were abandoned at specific times. The timeline is clearer, more reliable than when scholars depended on classical accounts and guesswork. Archaeobotany, the study of ancient plant remains, has revealed what Celts grew, what they ate, what they used for medicine and ritual. Seeds and pollen preserved in contexts like bog bodies or ritual deposits tell stories about diet, agriculture, ceremony. We can confirm that mistletoe was indeed used, that certain herbs appear repeatedly in ritual contexts, that feasting involved specific animals and preparations. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth reveals where people lived at different life stages, what they ate, whether they moved from region to region. We can track the travels of the Lindo man and others like him, determine whether they were local or foreign, whether their diets were high status or common. These chemical traces in preserved tissue give us biographical details no text could provide. Excavation of sacred sites has shown the complexity of Celtic religious practice. Votive offerings in lakes and rivers, thousands of objects deliberately deposited as gifts to divine powers. Weapons, jewelry, tools, sacrificed animals, evidence of feasting and ritual consumption. The sheer quantity suggests religious practice was pervasive, central to life, not occasional or peripheral. We've discovered that human sacrifice, while probably not as common as Roman sources suggested, definitely occurred. Multiple bog bodies show similar patterns. Ritual killings rather than murders, careful placement in sacred liminal spaces. The evidence is undeniable, though the frequency and exact religious significance remain debatable. Scholarship on Irish and Welsh manuscripts has become more sophisticated, better at distinguishing pre-Christian material from Christian additions, more careful about making claims beyond what evidence supports. We understand now that the myths as written reflect Christian editing, but that underneath that editing lie genuine pre-Christian traditions, recoverable with care and appropriate methodology. Comparative studies with other Indo-European cultures have illuminated Celtic religion by showing patterns that recur across related societies. Tripartite social structures, sacred kingship, the importance of poets and priests, beliefs about the otherworld, all these appear in Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and even distant Indian cultures, suggesting shared heritage from ancient common ancestors. The comparisons help us understand what is uniquely Celtic and what reflects broader Indo-European religious patterns. Yet for all we've learned, vast territories remain unknown. We still cannot read Druidic theology in their own words. We still don't know precisely what they believed about the afterlife, whether reincarnation was central or peripheral, what they thought happened to souls between lives. We don't know their prayers, their hymns, their sacred formulas. We know they existed, but we cannot hear them. We don't fully understand the calendar's religious significance. We have the Caligini calendar's structure, but not the theological meaning attached to specific days, months, divisions. We don't know why the sixth night of the moon mattered for mistletoe cutting, or what other lunar phases had significance, or how precisely they calculated festival dates. The relationship between Druids and gods remains shadowy. We have names of deities, but we don't know their full mythological narratives, their relationships to each other, the hierarchy of divine power. We know certain gods were important in certain regions, but not why or what theological principles governed divine worship. Modern scholarship is increasingly comfortable with uncertainty, with acknowledging gaps, with presenting multiple interpretations rather than claiming false certainty. We know more than the Victorians about what we don't know. We've gained humility, along with data. The Druids remain mysterious, and we've learned to accept that mystery rather than filling it with romantic invention. Some things are lost. Some questions cannot be answered. That's the nature of studying ancient cultures that left no written records, that deliberately chose secrecy over documentation. The eternal grove. Somewhere in the forest, perhaps in Ireland or Scotland or Wales, or perhaps only in imagination, a grove still stands. The oaks are ancient, their trunks thick as houses, their branches spreading wide enough to shelter gatherings. The ground beneath is soft with accumulated leaves, layer upon layer, centuries of falling and decay creating earth rich and dark and deep. No one comes here often. It is remote, difficult to reach, known only to a few, but it is not abandoned, not quite. Occasionally, someone arrives. They sit in silence among the trees. They feel the age of this place, the weight of years, the sense of something that persists beyond human knowing. Perhaps they feel the Druids here, not as ghosts but as memory, as the accumulated presence of all who once gathered in places like this, who spoke to gods among the oaks, who left their knowledge in the land itself, in the arrangement of stone and the flow of water, and the enduring patience of trees that outlive any human life. The grove asks nothing. It simply is. It was sacred before anyone called it sacred. It will remain, whether honoured or forgotten, whether visited or abandoned. The trees grow regardless. The seasons turn regardless. Rain falls, sun shines, leaves emerge and fall and emerge again in endless patient cycle. We cannot know what the Druids knew. That knowledge is gone, carried away by death and time and the breaking of oral chains. The secrets they guarded so carefully died with them. The sacred words are lost. The precise rituals, the theological subtleties, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of teaching, all vanish like breath on cold air, leaving no trace we can read or recover. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it honours what they valued. They chose mystery over revelation. They chose secrecy over publicity. They chose to leave nothing behind, to entrust their tradition to memory and voice, to accept that it would die when the chain broke, rather than compromise it through writing and preservation. The grove accepts this. The oaks do not mourn what is lost. They were here before the Druids. They will be here after. They witness the rituals and the sacrifices and the gathering of the learned in white robes speaking words of power. They witness the ending, the suppression, the withdrawal, the slow fading of a tradition into story. They grow still, indifferent to human knowledge and human loss, magnificent in their simple continuance. To stand in such a grove is to touch something beyond recovery. Not the Druids themselves, not their teaching, not their practice, but the space they occupied, the threshold they honoured, the sense they had, rightly, that some places matter more than others, that earth holds memory in its own way, that respect for mystery is sometimes wiser than the demand for answers. We will never know what they knew. That certainty is uncomfortable for modern minds that value information, that believe all knowledge should be accessible, that resist the idea that some things might be permanently lost. But the loss is real. The Druids are gone. Their knowledge is gone. Only echoes remain, fragmentary and uncertain, preserved by accident more than intention, filtered through hostile or uncomprehending observers, shaped by time and translation and the needs of those who came after. The Grove offers no solutions, no revelations, no sudden understanding. It offers only itself, trees and earth, shadow and light, the slow passage of seasons, the ancient patience of the natural world. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what the Druids would have wanted. Not understanding, but acknowledgement. Not answers, but appropriate silence. Not recovery, but respect for what cannot be recovered. The leaves whisper overhead. A bird calls from somewhere deep in the branches. The light shifts as clouds move. The grove continues, as it has continued, as it will continue. And in its continuance, something remains of what the Druids honoured, even if what they knew is lost forever. Legacy in shadow and light. They are everywhere and nowhere. The Druids, gone as a living tradition, as an active religion, as priests who serve and teach and judge, but present still in unexpected ways, in the folklore and customs and half-conscious practices of people who have no idea they are continuing, in diminished form, patterns established millennia ago. The seasonal festivals persist, transformed beyond recognition, but maintaining their essential rhythm. Halloween, once Samhain, the year's ending. Christmas, absorbing elements of winter solstice celebrations. May Day, echo of Beltane. Harvest festivals, though they've lost the name Lugnasad. The wheel turns still. People gather still. They mark the seasons still, perhaps without knowing why, without understanding that they participate in cycles their ancestors honoured, that the need to acknowledge time's passage, to celebrate survival of winter or arrival of spring, connects them to the Druids across the chasm of millennia. Language carries traces. Place names in Celtic regions preserve words from ancient languages. The rivers and hills and regions named for gods or sacred qualities. Thursday, etymologically unrelated to Celtic culture, but showing how days of the week preserve divine names across cultures. The names themselves are memory, keeping alive words that otherwise would be completely forgotten. The bardic tradition influenced European poetry profoundly. The complex meters, the emphasis on memorization and oral performance, the social role of the poet as preserver of memory and shaper of reputation, all this passed from Celtic cultures into medieval and then modern European literature. Shakespeare's plays were performed for audiences who couldn't read them, heard and remembered like Druidic teachings. The oral tradition never entirely died, even in literate cultures. It transformed, adapted, continued. Modern environmentalism sometimes finds inspiration in perceived Celtic attitudes toward nature. The idea that Earth is sacred, that humans should live in harmony with the natural world rather than dominating it, that ancient peoples knew truths modern civilization has forgotten. These ideas draw partly on Druidic imagery. Whether the historical Druids actually believed what modern environmentalists attribute to them is debatable, but the symbol has power regardless of historical accuracy. The Druid as nature priest, as one who honours trees and animals and the rhythms of the land, serves contemporary needs, even if it simplifies or misrepresents ancient practice. Fantasy literature is full of druids, wizards drawing on Celtic imagery, magic systems influenced by what writers imagine Druidic practice might have been. Tolkien's Gandalf owes something to the Druid archetype. Countless novels, games, films employ Druids as characters, usually more imaginative than historical but keeping the name alive, making each generation aware that such figures existed, that Celtic culture produced something intriguing and mysterious. Modern pagan movements, particularly Celtic Reconstructionism and Druidry, attempt to revive or reinvent pre-Christian Celtic religion. These are new religions, not continuations of ancient practice, but they represent genuine spiritual seeking, people finding meaning in what they can recover or imagine about Druidic tradition. The practitioners are sincere, even if the tradition they follow is more modern than ancient. Academic study continues. Celtic departments in universities, scholarly journals, archaeological expeditions. Each year, more is learned, more evidence uncovered, more papers published, refining understanding of this vanished world. The Druids fascinate scholars as they fascinate the general public, presenting puzzles that cannot be fully solved but remain eternally engaging. Perhaps the greatest legacy is the reminder that cultures rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost, that what seems permanent and powerful can vanish almost completely. The Druids were highly educated, sophisticated, essential to their society. They commanded respect across the entire Celtic world, and then they were gone, their learning lost, their tradition broken, their names surviving only in fragments recorded by their enemies. It is a sobering lesson about impermanence, about the fragility of oral traditions, about how quickly the living voice can be silenced and forgotten. But it is also a lesson about resilience, about how thoroughly something can be suppressed and yet leave traces, how memory persists in unexpected forms, how the human need to connect with the past ensures that even fragments become precious, that even echoes matter. The Druids did not survive. Their knowledge did not survive. But their shadow remains, long and complex, falling across centuries, shaping imagination and inquiry, reminding us that before our world, other worlds existed, equally real, equally meaningful to those who inhabited them. Now gone but not entirely forgotten, the grove is quiet now. The last words have been spoken, the last ritual performed. The last druid who remembers the old ways in Tyre has died, carrying unchained knowledge into the other world, leaving behind only fragments, hints, shadows on the wall of time. The tradition that stretched back through generations, that connected the living to ancestors beyond counting, has ended. Not dramatically, not in fire and violence, though there was fire, though there was violence, but quietly, finally, in the death of old men who had no students, in the last recitation of verses no one would hear again, in the slow fading of memory, from vivid presence to distant echo to silence. We have travelled far together tonight, you and I, through the forests of ancient Gaul and Britain, through the sacred groves, where no stone marked the holy ground, through the years of training and memorization, through the seasonal wheels turning and the ceremonies that marked each festival, through the terrible collision with Rome and the destruction of Anglesey, through the survival in Ireland and the transformation into medieval poets and Christian monks, through the Romantic revival and modern scholarship's careful reconstruction of fragments. We have met the Druids as judges and teachers, as astronomers and healers, as priests speaking to gods we can no longer name with certainty. We have stood in their presence through second-person immersion, felt what they might have felt, seen what they might have seen, understood dimly the power they wielded and the mysteries they guarded. We have followed them to their ending and beyond, watching as oral tradition became written story, as religious practice became cultural memory, as living faith became academic subject and romantic symbol. What remains? The stones they did not raise but honoured, the wells still visited by people who have forgotten why water from certain sources seems blessed, the festivals transformed into modern holidays, the stories preserved by monks who served different gods but valued their people's heritage, the questions we cannot answer, the knowledge irrecoverably lost, the appropriate mystery that surrounds them still, and perhaps something more, perhaps the reminder that wisdom comes in many forms, that science and technology are not the only kinds of knowledge worth having, that memory and tradition and connection to the land and to the ancestors, these matter too, are part of what makes us human, What gives life meaning beyond mere survival? The Druids knew things we have forgotten. Not the chemistry of willow bark, but that certain plants ease pain, that paying attention to nature provides practical benefits. Not astronomy as quantified science, but that sky and earth are connected, that celestial patterns shape terrestrial experience. Not written law, but justice as living practice, as wisdom accumulated and transmitted, as human judgment applied to human problems. Not psychology as clinical discipline, but that words have power, that stories shape reality, that community requires shared memory and shared meaning. We cannot return to Druidic practice. We should not want to. Their world is gone, and we are not Celtic warriors, depending on Druids to judge our disputes or calculate our festivals, but we can learn from them nonetheless. From their respect for learning, their dedication to memory, their understanding that some knowledge requires long apprenticeship, that wisdom cannot be rushed or shortcut. From their sense of the sacred in nature, their recognition that certain places, certain times, carry special significance worth honouring. From their maintenance of tradition across generations, their creation of continuity that sustained Celtic culture through centuries of change. I'm grateful we could travel these ancient paths together tonight. May the questions the Druids leave us be generative rather than frustrating, invitations to wonder rather than anxiety about ignorance. May the fragments that survive remind us to value what we have while we have it, to preserve what matters, to respect mystery when we encounter it. May the Druids rest in their other world, their gods and goddesses beside them, their sacred groves growing still in places beyond our reaching, honoured by our respectful acknowledgement that they were here, that they mattered, that they left us gifts, even in their leaving. Let the weight of centuries lift as you drift into dreams.